Detective Sarah Chun had begun to notice something remarkable happening in the schools and neighborhoods where the networks of care had been operating for more than a decade. The children who had grown up receiving and witnessing acts of anonymous assistance, who had seen their parents and grandparents participate in informal systems of mutual aid, were now teenagers and young adults who approached community life with assumptions and expectations that differed fundamentally from previous generations. These young people seemed to take for granted that community should care for their most vulnerable members, that individual success should contribute to collective welfare, and that problems should be addressed through cooperation rather than competition. They organized their social relationships around principles of mutual support that they had absorbed through daily observation of how the adults in their lives had chosen to care for each other. The shift had become apparent during Sarah's routine visits to Washington Elementary School, where she had been working with administrators and teachers to document how the educational support networks had evolved over the years. Principal Angela Rodriguez had mentioned that students were spontaneously organizing their own systems of peer tutoring and mutual assistance that reflected the principles they had observed in the adult community around them. The children seemed to understand instinctively that everyone should have access to help when they need it. Principal Rodriguez explained during one of Sarah's regular visits to the school. They notice when classmates are struggling academically or socially, and they naturally organize themselves to provide support without being asked or instructed by adults. It's as if they've internalized the idea that caring for each other is simply what people do. Sarah had begun documenting these emerging patterns of youth-led mutual aid, recognizing that they represented something unprecedented, evidence that principles of community care could be transmitted across generations through observation and participation rather than formal instruction. The young people who had grown up in neighborhoods where anonymous assistance was normal were creating their own versions of mutual support that reflected their developmental needs and social circumstances. Case number 2029-031567 involved Lincoln Middle School, where students had organized an informal system of academic support that operated during lunch periods and after-school hours. The student-led tutoring network had developed without adult supervision or official authorization, emerging naturally from students' understanding that academic success should be available to everyone regardless of their individual learning challenges or family circumstances. 8th grader Maria Santos had been identified as one of the organizers of the peer tutoring network, though she seemed puzzled by adult interest in activities that she considered normal aspects of school life. When Sarah interviewed her about how the tutoring system had developed, Maria expressed surprise that anyone would find it unusual for students to help each other succeed academically. Some kids are good at math and some are good at reading, Maria explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. So the kids who are good at things help the kids who are learning those things. That's just how it works. My mom always told me that when people are good at something, they should share what they know with people who need help. The student tutoring network had developed organizational structures that reflected sophisticated understanding of individual learning differences and group dynamics. Students had created schedules that matched tutors with learners based on subject expertise and personality compatibility, had established quiet spaces where academic assistance could be provided without creating embarrassment for students who needed help, and had developed recognition systems that honored both teaching and learning as valuable contributions to community welfare. Sarah's investigation revealed that the student organizers had learned these organizational principles through observation of how the adult networks functioned in their neighborhoods and families. They had absorbed lessons about preserving dignity while providing assistance, about coordinating services to avoid duplication, and about creating voluntary participation, systems that encouraged, rather than required mutual support that the peer tutoring network had, produced measurable improvements in academic performance across all grade levels, had reduced disciplinary problems by creating positive social connections between students who might otherwise have had limited interaction, and had demonstrated that young people possessed remarkable capacities for organizing themselves according to principles of mutual aid when they had grown up. Observing such principles in operation. Teacher Rebecca Kim had noticed that students involved in the peer tutoring network showed increased engagement with their formal academic work, seemed more confident in their learning abilities, and demonstrated better social skills and leadership capabilities than their peers who had not participated in mutual support activities. The students who are involved in helping each other learn seem to understand their academic work differently, Teacher Kim observed. They see learning as something that happens in community rather than just individually, and they approach challenges with more patience and creativity because they know they can get help when they need it and can contribute their own knowledge to help others. As Sarah continued to document youth-led mutual aid activities, she began to understand that these young people were creating innovations that enhanced rather than simply replicated the adult networks that had shaped their understanding of community life. The student organizers were adapting principles of mutual care to address the specific challenges and opportunities that characterized their developmental stage and social environment. Case number 2029052134 involved the Riverside Community Center, where teenagers had organized a comprehensive system of peer support that addressed academic, social, and emotional needs while creating opportunities for civic engagement and community service. The youth network had developed without adult direction, emerging from teenagers' understanding that individual welfare was connected to collective health and that their generation had responsibilities for maintaining and improving the community conditions they had inherited. 16-year-old David Chun had been identified as one of the coordinators of the Youth Mutual Aid Network, though he described his role more as facilitating connections than providing leadership. When Sarah interviewed him about how the network had developed, David explained that the organizational structure had emerged gradually as teenagers had recognized shared challenges and complementary resources. We all have different things we're good at, and different things we need help with, David explained. Some people are good at school stuff, some are good at dealing with family problems, some are good at job skills or creative projects. We figured out that we can help each other more effectively if we organized ourselves better and shared information about what people needed and what they could offer. The youth network had created systems for matching teenagers who needed assistance with peers who possessed relevant skills or experience. Students who were struggling with academic work could access tutoring from peers who excelled in specific subjects. Teenagers who were dealing with family conflicts or social challenges could receive support from peers who had successfully navigated similar situations. Young people who were interested in developing job skills or exploring career options could connect with peers who had gained relevant experience through part-time employment or volunteer activities. The network had also developed community service components that enabled teenagers to contribute their energy and skills to addressing problems that affected the broader community. Youth volunteers had organized environmental cleanup projects, had provided technology assistance for elderly residents, had created recreational programs for younger children, and had developed advocacy campaigns that addressed issues affecting their generation's future prospects. Sarah's investigation revealed that the youth network operated according to principles of voluntary participation, mutual respect, and collective responsibility that directly reflected the values they had observed in the adult networks that had shaped their community environment. The teenagers had internalized understanding that assistance should preserve dignity, that participation should be based on individual choice rather than external requirement, and that community welfare required active contribution from everyone according to their abilities and interests. Asterisk. The youth network had created governance structures that emphasized consensus decision-making, rotational leadership, and transparency in resource allocation. The organizational methods reflected sophisticated understanding of democratic participation and collective problem-solving that the teenagers had learned through observation of how the adult networks maintained their effectiveness and community support. Community Center Director Michael Rodriguez had observed that the youth network had become a pipeline for developing future leaders who possessed both practical organizing skills and deep commitment to community welfare. Teenagers who had participated in peer support activities showed increased civic engagement, were more likely to pursue higher education and career paths that served community needs, and maintained their involvement in mutual aid activities as they transitioned to adult roles and responsibilities. The young people who have grown up in this environment seem to understand naturally that individual success should contribute to community welfare. Director Rodriguez observed. They approach their education, career choices, and personal relationships with awareness that their decisions affect not just themselves but the broader community that has supported their development. As Sarah continued to document the emerging patterns of youth-led mutual aid, she began to understand that these activities represented something unprecedented in her experience, evidence that principles of community care could be successfully transmitted across generations through modeling and participation rather than formal instruction or institutional programming. The young people who had grown up observing anonymous assistance and informal networks of mutual support had developed their own approaches to community care that reflected both continuity with established principles and innovation in response to their generation's particular circumstances and challenges. Case number 20290708892 involved multiple high schools throughout the city, where students had organized interconnected networks of peer support that addressed academic, social, and economic challenges while creating opportunities for leadership development and civic engagement. The student networks had developed communication systems that enabled coordination across different schools and neighborhoods, creating citywide systems of youth mutual aid that operated independently of adult supervision or institutional oversight. 17-year-old Jennifer Martinez had been identified as one of the coordinators of the interschool network, though she emphasized that the organizational structure was deliberately decentralized to ensure that no individual or group could control or dominate the system. When Sarah interviewed her about the network's development, Jennifer explained that the coordination had emerged from students' recognition that many challenges affected young people across different schools and neighborhoods. We realized that a lot of us were dealing with similar problems, like needing help with college applications, or finding jobs, or dealing with stress from family or school situations. Jennifer explained. We figured out that we could help each other more effectively if we shared resources and information across different schools, instead of each school trying to solve everything separately. The interschool network had created systems for sharing information about academic opportunities, job openings, scholarship programs, and social services that could benefit teenagers throughout the city. Students had developed peer counseling programs that addressed mental health challenges, substance abuse issues, and family conflicts that might otherwise have gone unaddressed or required expensive professional intervention. The network had also organized advocacy campaigns that addressed policy issues affecting young people's educational and economic opportunities. Students had successfully advocated for increased funding for school counseling services, had organized voter registration drives that increased civic participation among young adults, and had developed environmental sustainability projects that addressed climate change concerns while creating opportunities for practical learning and community engagement. Sarah's investigation revealed that the inter-school network operated according to principles of horizontal organization rather than hierarchical control, reflecting the students' understanding that effective mutual aid required shared power rather than concentrated authority. The network had developed conflict resolution procedures, resource allocation systems, and decision-making processes that emphasize transparency, accountability, and inclusion of diverse perspectives. The student organizers had learned these organizational principles through participation in the adult networks that operated in their neighborhoods and families, but they had adapted them to address the specific challenges and opportunities that characterized their generation's social and political environment. High school counselor Patricia Wong had observed that students involved in the inter-school network showed increased academic motivation, better emotional regulation skills, and greater confidence in their ability to address challenges and pursue opportunities. The peer support activities seemed to provide social connections and practical assistance that enhanced rather than competed with formal educational programming. The students who participate in these networks seem to approach their education and future planning with more optimism and realistic confidence, Counselor Wong noted. They understand that they don't have to face challenges alone, and they seem to have better skills for seeking help when they need it and offering assistance when they can provide it. As Sarah documented the expanding scope of youth-led mutual aid activities, she began to understand that these young people were creating something that had implications beyond their immediate community. They were demonstrating that principles of mutual care could be scaled up and adapted to address complex social challenges while maintaining their essential character and effectiveness. The youth networks represented evidence that the community care principles documented in the archive could be transmitted across generations and adapted to changing social circumstances while maintaining their core commitment to collective welfare and individual dignity. The teenagers who had grown up observing anonymous assistance and informal mutual aid had internalized understanding that communities could organize themselves according to principles that created environments where everyone could develop their potential while contributing to collective prosperity and social justice. As Sarah completed her documentation of the youth networks, she understood that she was witnessing something remarkable: the emergence of a generation that had learned to take mutual care for granted, that approached community life with assumptions about cooperation and collective responsibility that could transform how human societies organized themselves to address shared challenges and opportunities. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar lullaby in the precinct as Sarah wrote reports that documented not just youth activities, but evidence of successful cultural transmission across generations, proof that principles of community care could become embedded in social consciousness through modeling and participation rather than formal instruction or institutional programming. The young people who had grown up in neighborhoods where anonymous assistance was normal were creating their own innovations in mutual aid that reflected both continuity with established principles and adaptation to their generation's particular circumstances and aspirations. They were demonstrating that community care was not just a nostalgic ideal, but a living practice that could evolve and flourish when it was supported by social environments that honored cooperation and collective welfare. The archive had documented how communities could function according to their highest values, and now the children who had grown up in those communities were proving that such values could be transmitted across generations, creating possibilities for social transformation that extended far beyond the neighborhoods where the journey had begun. Asterisk Detective Sarah Chun had been sitting in the archive for nearly an hour before she noticed that something fundamental had changed in how she experienced the space. The filing cabinets still stretched through the basement in their familiar rows. The fluorescent lights still hummed their steady lullaby, and the dust motes still danced in the artificial light. But the weight of mystery that had once filled these corridors had been replaced by something else, a sense of completion that felt both satisfying and strangely melancholy. The archive had become a living document that continued to grow, but its new additions were no longer mysterious cases requiring investigation. They were documentation of successful implementations, reports from communities around the world that had adapted the principles discovered in these basements, files to their own circumstances and challenges. The mystery had been solved so thoroughly that it had transformed into something else entirely, proof that human communities could organize themselves according to their highest values when they understood what was possible. Asterisk Sarah had received a letter that morning from Dr. Elena Rodriguez in Barcelona, reporting that the community policing program, based on the archive principles, had reduced crime rates while improving citizen satisfaction to levels that had attracted attention from the European Union as a model for urban safety initiatives. The program had been so successful that 12 other Spanish cities were implementing similar approaches, creating a network of communities that were demonstrating how law enforcement could serve community development rather than just crisis response. Similar reports arrived regularly from around the world. Commander Thompson in Vancouver, documenting how community facilitation techniques had transformed relationships between police and immigrant communities. Inspector Gonzalez in Mexico City, describing how informal assistance networks had reduced the social problems that traditionally led to criminal activity. Chief Superintendent Kim in Seoul, reporting how traditional values of community responsibility had been successfully integrated with contemporary approaches to public safety. Each report represented communities that had learned to function according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. Places where anonymous assistance was no longer mysterious because it had become a normal expression of how people cared for each other. The archive had somehow become a form of assistance itself, providing communities with evidence that alternatives to social isolation and individual vulnerability were not just possible but practical and sustainable. The irony had not escaped Sarah's attention. The archive that had been created to document unexplained acts of kindness had become an act of kindness itself, offering communities around the world proof that they could organize themselves according to principles that created safety and security through cooperation rather than control. The basement files had become anonymous assistants on a global scale, helping people she would never meet to understand that mutual care was not an impossible ideal, but a realistic approach to community development. She had been invited to participate in a video conference that afternoon with representatives from 53 cities on 6 continents that were implementing programs based on the archive principles. The conference was part of an ongoing effort to create international networks of communities that were committed to demonstrating how human societies could function when they operated according to values of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The conference room in the precinct had been equipped with technology that connected Sarah to community leaders, police administrators, social workers, and researchers who were working to transform how their cities approached public safety and social services. The participants represented diverse cultural backgrounds and economic circumstances, but they shared common commitment to the understanding that individual welfare was inseparable from community health. Mayor Catherine Laurent from Lyon, France, was the first to report on her city's experience implementing community-centered approaches to public service. Lyon had adapted the archive principles to address challenges related to immigration, unemployment, and social cohesion in neighborhoods where traditional institutions had struggled to build trust and effectiveness. We have learned that communities possess remarkable resources for addressing their own challenges when they are supported rather than replaced by official programs. Mayor Laurent explained through the video connection. The archive principles helped us understand that our role as government officials should be to create conditions that enable informal networks of care to flourish rather than attempting to provide all services through bureaucratic institutions. Police Chief Robert O'Brien from Dublin, Ireland, described how his department had trained officers to recognize and support informal assistance networks while developing new approaches to crime prevention that addressed underlying social conditions, rather than just responding to incidents after they occurred. The archive documentation showed us that effective crime prevention requires communities where people feel connected to and responsible for each other's welfare. Chief O'Brien reported, "When officers understand their role as supporting community relationships rather than just enforcing regulations, they become more effective at preventing problems while building the trust that enables genuine cooperation between police and residents." Dr. Amina Hassan from Cairo, Egypt, had been working to adapt the archive principles to address challenges in densely populated urban areas where traditional family and neighborhood structures were being transformed by economic and social change. Her research focused on how informal networks of mutual aid could emerge in communities where people had limited previous experience with such systems. The archive provides evidence that mutual aid is not dependent on particular cultural traditions, but represents universal human capacities that can be developed when people understand their potential for collective action. Dr. Hassan explained, "We have seen remarkable innovations emerge when communities are given support and recognition for their efforts to care for their members, according to principles of dignity and voluntary participation." Professor João Silva from São Paulo, Brazil, described how favela communities had used archive principles to develop comprehensive systems of mutual support that addressed education, healthcare, economic development, and public safety challenges that official institutions had been unable to address effectively through traditional programmatic approaches. The communities that have been most successful in implementing these principles are often those that have been most marginalized by formal institutions. Professor Silva observed, "When people understand that they have the capacity to organize themselves according to values of mutual aid and collective responsibility, they can create remarkable innovations that serve their needs while contributing to broader social transformation." As the conference continued through the afternoon, Sarah began to understand that the archive had become something she had never anticipated, a catalyst for global transformation that was enabling communities around the world to discover their own capacities for mutual care and collective problem solving. The basement files that had once documented isolated instances of mysterious assistance had become evidence that such assistance was not mysterious at all, but represented fundamental human possibilities that could be developed and sustained when communities understood what was possible. The reports from conference participants revealed that successful implementation of archive principles required adaptation to local circumstances and cultural contexts, but that certain core elements remained consistent across different communities: voluntary participation, preservation of dignity, collective responsibility for individual welfare, and understanding that formal institutions were most effective when they supported rather than replaced informal networks of mutual care. Dr. Sarah Osei from Accra, Ghana, had been working with traditional chiefs and community elders to integrate archive principles with indigenous practices of collective decision-making and mutual support. Her research demonstrated how contemporary approaches to community development could build on traditional values while addressing modern challenges related to urbanization and economic change. The archive principles are consistent with traditional African values of Ubuntu and collective responsibility, Dr. Ussi explained, but they provide practical frameworks for adapting these values to contemporary circumstances where communities face challenges that require new forms of organization and coordination. Community organizer Maria Fernandez from Guatemala City described how neighborhoods affected by violence and poverty had used archive principles to develop alternatives to both criminal organizations and ineffective government programs. The informal networks of mutual aid had created opportunities for young people to participate in positive community activities while addressing underlying conditions that had previously made criminal involvement seem like the only available option for economic survival. When communities understand that they have the capacity to create their own solutions to social problems, they can develop innovations that are more effective than external interventions, Maria reported. The archive principles helped us understand that community safety comes from people caring for each other rather than from external control or punishment. As the video conference concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her regular duties, she found herself reflecting on how her individual journey of discovery had connected her to a global community of people who shared commitment to demonstrating that human societies could organize themselves according to their highest values and most generous impulses. Asterisk, the archive had become proof that individual insights could have collective impact, that local innovations could inspire global transformation, and that communities could learn from each other across cultural and geographical boundaries when they shared commitment to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The basement files would continue to serve as evidence that anonymous assistance was not an exceptional occurrence, but a normal expression of human capacity for cooperation and care. The documentation would preserve proof that communities could function according to principles that created environments where everyone could live with dignity and security, while contributing to collective welfare and individual flourishing. That evening, Sarah received a phone call from Margaret Sullivan, who had been coordinating the local networks for more than 20 years and who had become something of an elder stateswoman for the community care movement that had grown from the archive discoveries. Sarah, Margaret said, her voice carrying the warmth and wisdom that had made her such an effective coordinator of mutual aid activities. I wanted you to know that we've been receiving letters from young people in communities around the world who have read about our work and want to start similar networks in their own neighborhoods. It seems that the principles we've been practicing here have given people hope that they can create the kinds of communities they want to live in. Sarah understood that Margaret was telling her something significant, that the archive had become a form of anonymous assistance that was reaching people she would never meet, providing them with evidence that alternatives to social isolation and individual vulnerability were not just possible but practical and achievable when communities committed themselves to principles of mutual care and collective responsibility. The circle was complete. The mysterious assistance that had once puzzled investigating officers had been revealed as evidence of human capacity for remarkable generosity and wisdom. The documentation of that assistance had become a resource for communities around the world that were working to demonstrate that societies could organize themselves according to values that created safety and security for everyone. The archive had transformed from a collection of unsolved mysteries into proof that the most profound mysteries were actually simple truths about human nature that became visible when people organized their lives around principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The basement files had become anonymous assistance on a global scale, helping communities understand that caring for each other was not an obligation but a privilege, not a burden but a joy, not a mystery but the most natural expression of what it meant to be fully human. As Sarah turned off the lights in the archive and made her way toward the basement exit, she understood that her work had evolved beyond individual case investigation to include curating evidence that communities could create environments where anonymous assistance flourished because caring for others had become as natural as breathing. as automatic as sunrise, as reliable as the changing. Seasons that marked the passage of time in places where people had learned to live, according to their highest values and most generous understanding of what community life could become. Fluorescent lights hummed their eternal lullaby over the filing cabinets that contained thousands of stories about people who had chosen to care for each other without expecting recognition or reward. The archive would preserve these stories for future generations who might need evidence that such caring was possible, that communities could organize themselves according to principles that created something approaching the ideal of what human society could achieve when it operated according to the simple understanding that individual welfare and collective health were not separate concerns but different aspects of the same fundamental truth about what it meant to be human. The mystery was solved, and the solution was beautiful. People caring for each other, because that was what people did when they remembered that love was more powerful than fear, that cooperation was more sustainable than competition, and that communities could create environments where everyone could flourish, when they understood that their own well-being was inseparably connected to the welfare of everyone around them. Asterisk. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, written in careful script on paper that carried the faint scent of lavender and old books. Detective Sarah Chun, now retired but still serving as Director Emeritus of the archive, recognized the handwriting immediately, though she had not seen it in nearly 15 years. The return address was from a small town in northern Vermont, a place called Millfield that she had never visited but had heard about in stories that seemed too gentle to be entirely true. The letter was from Emily Foster, granddaughter of Mrs. Helen Foster, who had been among the first recipients of anonymous assistance that Sarah had documented during her early investigations. Emily was now 28 years old, working as a teacher in a rural school district that served farming communities where winter meant 5 months of snow and spring brought mud season that tested everyone's patience and resilience. Dear Detective Chun, the letter began. I hope you remember my grandmother, who used to receive those wonderful meals and grocery deliveries that nobody could ever explain. She passed away peacefully last spring at the age of 97, still living in her own home, still tending the garden that someone had maintained for her during that difficult recovery from surgery all those years ago. Sarah settled into the comfortable reading chair in her home office, surrounded by books and photographs that documented decades of correspondence with communities around the world that had been inspired by the archive discoveries. The afternoon light filtered through windows that looked out onto a garden where she had learned to grow vegetables using techniques that Mr. Thompson had shared with her before his own peaceful death the previous winter. Emily's letter continued with news that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone who had not spent decades studying patterns of mutual care and community development. She described how the young people in Millfield had begun organizing themselves to address challenges that their rural community faced: an aging population that needed help maintaining independence, economic pressures that threatened family farms, and social isolation that often accompanied the beautiful but demanding landscape of northern New England. We didn't plan it or announce it, Emily wrote. It just started happening naturally. Some of us noticed that Mrs. Patterson was having trouble getting to her medical appointments after her son moved to Boston for work. A few people mentioned that the Johnson farm needed help with harvest after Mr. Johnson broke his ankle. The Henderson family was struggling to pay for heating oil after the factory closed and Mrs. Henderson lost her job. Sarah recognized the familiar patterns immediately. Young adults who had grown up observing mutual care beginning to organize their own systems of assistance without formal planning or institutional support. But Emily's description suggested innovations that reflected both continuity with established principles and adaptation to contemporary circumstances and rural Challenges. We started meeting at the community center on Sunday evenings, not to make formal plans, but just to share information about who might need help and who had skills or resources to offer. Emily continued. We created a private social media group where people could post about needs or offers without having to ask for help publicly. We developed carpooling systems for medical appointments, grocery shopping, and social activities that reduced isolation while sharing transportation costs. The Millfield network had evolved to address challenges that were specific to rural communities, where distances were greater, resources were more limited, and traditional institutions like banks and healthcare facilities were disappearing as economic forces concentrated services in larger population centers. The young people had created innovations that preserved the essential principles of mutual aid while adapting to geographical and economic realities that required different approaches to coordination and service delivery. Emily described how the network had organized skill sharing, workshops where older community members taught traditional crafts and farming techniques to younger residents who were interested in developing self-sufficiency skills. The workshops had created intergenerational connections while preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as older practitioners died without having opportunities to pass on their expertise. Mr. Davies, who's 86 and worked as a blacksmith before he retired, has been teaching several of us traditional metalworking techniques, Emily wrote. Mrs. Chun, who came here from Taiwan 50 years ago, has been showing us how to preserve vegetables using methods that don't require expensive equipment or constant electricity. We're learning things that our grandparents knew, but that our parents' generation sometimes forgot in their rush to embrace modern conveniences. The skill sharing had created economic benefits, as well as social connections. Community members had developed small businesses that provided locally made products and services while reducing dependence on distant suppliers and expensive transportation. The network had created informal markets where people could trade goods and services without requiring cash transactions that might be difficult for residents on fixed incomes or seasonal employment. Sarah found herself thinking about how the Millfield innovations reflected evolution of mutual aid, principles to address contemporary challenges while maintaining their essential character. The young people were using technology to facilitate communication and coordination, but they were doing so in ways that preserved privacy and voluntary participation. They were creating economic alternatives that reduced dependence on global systems while maintaining connections to the broader world through networks of communities that shared similar values and approaches. Emily's letter included photographs that showed community members working together on various projects, a group of teenagers and elderly residents building raised garden beds that would be easier for people with mobility limitations to maintain, young adults helping an elderly farmer repair equipment using traditional techniques combined with modern materials, families gathering for a potluck dinner where the food had been grown and prepared using locally sourced ingredients and traditional methods. The most remarkable thing, Emily wrote, is how natural it all feels. None of us thinks we're doing anything unusual or special. We're just doing what makes sense when you live in a small community, where everyone's welfare affects everyone else's quality of life. But visitors from other places sometimes seem amazed by how we organize ourselves to address problems and take advantage of opportunities. Sarah recognized that Emily was describing something precious, evidence that principles of mutual care could be transmitted across generations and adapted to different circumstances while maintaining their effectiveness and appeal for young people who were seeking alternatives to social isolation and economic vulnerability. The letter described how the Millfield network had attracted attention from other rural communities that were facing similar challenges related to aging populations, economic pressures, and geographic isolation. Emily had been invited to speak at regional conferences where rural development specialists were exploring alternatives to traditional economic development, approaches that often failed to address the specific needs and resources of small communities. We've been sharing our experience with communities in other states that are trying to develop their own approaches to mutual aid and local economic development, Emily wrote. It's been interesting to learn how different places adapt the basic principles to their own circumstances and challenges. A fishing community in Maine has developed different approaches than a farming community in Iowa, but the underlying ideas about cooperation and collective responsibility seem to work everywhere. Sarah understood that Emily was describing the emergence of what researchers were beginning to call the third generation of mutual aid networks, young adults who had grown up in communities where such networks were normal and who were creating their own innovations that reflected both inherited wisdom and contemporary insights about community development and social organization. The letter continued with descriptions of specific projects that demonstrated how the Millfield Network had developed sophisticated approaches to addressing complex challenges while maintaining the voluntary participation and dignity preservation that characterized effective mutual aid systems. We organized a home winterization project where people with construction skills helped elderly and disabled residents prepare their houses for winter, Emily wrote. We coordinated with the Regional Energy Assistance Program to maximize the benefits of both formal and informal resources. We created a system for sharing heating costs among households that had different heating systems and energy usage patterns. The winterization project had become a model for how informal networks could work with official programs to create more comprehensive and effective assistance than either approach could provide independently. The collaboration had enabled more families to remain safely in their homes during the harsh northern Vermont winters, while reducing energy costs and environmental impact through improved efficiency and shared resources. Emily described how the network had also developed approaches to healthcare support that addressed the challenges of accessing medical services in rural areas, where specialists were hours away and transportation was complicated by weather and distance. We created a system for coordinating medical appointments so that people traveling to the regional hospital could provide transportation for others who needed to see doctors or specialists, Emily wrote. We organized medication sharing for people who had prescriptions they couldn't afford or couldn't access easily. We developed peer support groups for people dealing with chronic conditions who needed emotional support and practical advice from others who understood their challenges. The healthcare initiatives had created measurable improvements in health outcomes while reducing costs for both individuals and the broader healthcare system. The coordination had enabled people to access care they might otherwise have forgone due to transportation or financial barriers, while the peer support had provided emotional resources that complemented formal medical treatment. Sarah found herself marveling at how the Millfield innovations reflected sophisticated understanding of systems thinking and collaborative problem solving that Emily's generation had apparently absorbed through observation and participation in communities where mutual aid was normal rather than exceptional. The letter concluded with an invitation that surprised Sarah with its directness and significance. Detective Chun, Emily wrote, we would be honored if you would consider visiting Millfield to see what we've been doing and to help us understand how our work connects to the broader movement of communities that are organizing themselves according to principles of mutual care and collective responsibility. We think you might find it interesting to see how the ideas documented in your archive have evolved and adapted to rural circumstances and contemporary challenges. Sarah found herself considering an invitation that represented an opportunity to witness how the principles discovered in the basement archive had continued to evolve and adapt across generations and geographical contexts. The Millfield Network represented evidence that mutual aid was not a historical artifact, but a living practice that could continue to develop innovative approaches to community challenges while maintaining its essential commitment to dignity, voluntary participation, and collective welfare. The invitation also represented an opportunity to document how the third generation of mutual aid practitioners was creating innovations that might inform other communities' efforts to develop their own approaches to mutual care and local problem solving. Emily's generation had grown up taking community support for granted and was now creating systems that reflected both inherited wisdom and contemporary insights about social organization and economic development. As Sarah prepared her response to Emily's letter, she understood that the invitation represented more than just the opportunity to visit a rural community. It was a chance to witness how the archive discoveries had continued to evolve and inspire new generations of people who were committed to demonstrating that communities could organize themselves according to their highest values while addressing practical challenges that affected everyone's quality of life. The fluorescent lights that had once hummed over the basement archive had been replaced by LED fixtures that provided the same steady illumination with greater efficiency and environmental sustainability. But the files themselves remained unchanged, preserving evidence that communities could function according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility that created environments where everyone could live with dignity and security. The archive had become a living document that continued to grow through reports from communities around the world that were implementing and adapting its principles. The basement storage had evolved into a research center that attracted visitors from every continent who came to study evidence that human societies could organize themselves according to values that created prosperity and security through cooperation rather than competition. Sarah's correspondence with Emily represented the newest chapter in a story that had begun with mysterious acts of anonymous assistance and had evolved into a global movement of communities that were demonstrating alternatives to social isolation and individual vulnerability. The third generation of mutual aid practitioners was creating innovations that built on inherited wisdom while addressing contemporary challenges with creativity and sophisticated understanding of community development principles. The invitation to visit Millfield represented an opportunity to witness how the circle of care had expanded beyond urban neighborhoods to include rural communities that were adapting mutual aid principles to address challenges related to geographic isolation, economic pressures, and demographic changes that required innovative approaches to community support and local development. The story continued, written now by young people who had grown up understanding that caring for others was not an obligation but a privilege, not a burden but a joy, not a mystery but the most natural expression of what it meant to live in community, with others who shared commitment to ensuring that everyone could thrive, while contributing to collective welfare and individual flourishing. Detective Sarah Chun had forgotten how beautiful October could be in New England, how the maples and birches transformed entire mountainsides into tapestries of gold and crimson that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The train from Boston wound through valleys where small farms were tucked between forested hills, where stone walls marked boundaries that had been established by farmers who had cleared these fields 2 centuries earlier with patience and determination that had created the foundation for everything that followed. She had accepted Emily Foster's invitation to visit Millfield, partly from curiosity about how rural communities were adapting mutual aid principles, but also from a deeper sense that her own understanding of community care remained incomplete. 25 years of documenting and studying networks of assistance had taught her much about how such systems functioned, but she realized that she had never experienced what it might feel like to live in a place where mutual support was simply the normal way that people organize their daily lives. The train station in Millfield was a modest wooden building that had been constructed during the railroad boom of the 1880s and had been carefully maintained by community volunteers who understood that transportation connections were essential for rural communities that needed access to markets and services in larger towns. The station served not just as a transportation hub, but as an informal community center where people gathered to share information and coordinate activities that required collaboration across different households and neighborhood groups. Emily Foster met Sarah at the station, driving a pickup truck that showed the wear patterns of constant use for hauling equipment, supplies, and passengers who needed transportation to places not served by public transit. Emily had grown into a woman who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to solve problems through cooperation rather than individual struggle, who understood her place in networks of mutual support that created security and opportunity for everyone involved. "Welcome to Millfield," Emily said as she helped Sarah load her luggage into the truck bed that was lined with hay bales and empty produce crates. "I hope you're prepared for a different pace of life than what you're probably used to in the city. Things move more slowly here, but they also tend to last longer and work better when everyone has time to think through what they're doing." The drive through Millfield revealed a community that had found ways to maintain its rural character while adapting to economic and social changes that had transformed many similar towns into either wealthy enclaves for urban refugees or impoverished areas that had been abandoned by younger generations seeking opportunities elsewhere. Millfield had somehow managed to create a third option, a working landscape where people of different ages and economic circumstances had found ways to build lives that combined traditional values with contemporary innovations. The houses were modest but well maintained, with gardens that showed evidence of serious food production rather than purely decorative landscaping. Many properties included workshops, barns, and other outbuildings that suggested residents were engaged in productive activities that contributed to household and community self-sufficiency. Solar panels and small wind turbines indicated investment in renewable energy systems that reduced dependence on distant power grids while creating local economic benefits. Emily explained that the community had made deliberate choices about development that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profit, that preserved agricultural land and forest resources while creating opportunities for young people to build careers that served local needs and contributed to regional economic vitality. "We've been working to create what economists call a circular economy, where waste from one activity becomes input for another activity," Emily said as they drove past a small manufacturing facility that was processing wood products from locally managed forests. The sawmill provides lumber for construction projects while the sawdust and wood chips go to heat community buildings and provide mulch for gardens. The food processing facility preserves vegetables from local farms while the compost from food waste enriches soil for next year's crops. The circular economy approach had created employment opportunities that enabled young people to remain in or return to Millfield while developing careers that contributed to community welfare rather than extracting resources for the benefit of distant investors. The local businesses were owned by community members who understood that their success depended on the prosperity and stability of their neighbors and customers. Emily's house occupied a hillside location that provided views of the valley while remaining connected to the village center through walking trails and bicycle paths that encouraged non-automotive transportation. The house itself reflected the community's approach to sustainable development, well insulated but modest in scale, powered by renewable energy systems, designed to age gracefully while requiring minimal maintenance and environmental impact. The interior revealed a combination of traditional craftsmanship and contemporary technology that had been integrated thoughtfully to serve practical needs while preserving aesthetic values that connected residents to the cultural heritage of rural New England. Hand-hewn beams supported solar-powered LED lighting systems. Traditional wood-burning stoves provided backup heating for modern radiant floor systems. Local pottery and textiles decorated spaces that were organized for both privacy and community gathering. I built this house with help from about 30 community members who contributed different skills at different stages of the construction. Emily explained as she prepared tea using herbs that had been grown and dried by neighbors, who maintained extensive medicinal and culinary gardens. The timber came from our community forest, the stone from a local quarry, the labor from people who understood that helping me build a good house meant strengthening the community's capacity to help everyone live well. The house construction had exemplified the community's approach to major projects, collaborative efforts that served individual needs while building collective skills and strengthening social relationships that supported long-term community resilience. The barn-raising tradition had been adapted to contemporary circumstances and building codes, while maintaining its essential character as community celebration and mutual aid activity. As evening approached, Emily invited Sarah to attend the weekly community gathering at the village center, a restored 19th century meeting hall that served multiple functions as performance space, meeting venue, educational facility, and social hub that brought people together for activities that ranged from practical planning to cultural celebration. The community center was filled with perhaps 60 people representing all age groups and various occupations and backgrounds, but united by shared commitment to the values and practices that had made Millfield an example of successful rural community development. The gathering began with a potluck dinner featuring food that had been grown, raised, and prepared locally according to traditional methods and recipes that reflected the cultural diversity of families who had chosen to make Millfield their home. Sarah found herself seated between Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose transportation needs had helped catalyze the formation of the mutual aid network, and David Kim, a young engineer who had returned to Millfield after completing graduate studies in renewable energy systems. The conversation revealed how different generations and professional backgrounds contributed to community problem solving while learning from each other's knowledge and perspectives. Mrs. Patterson, now 89 years old, described how the community support had enabled her to remain in her own home while contributing her skills as a retired librarian to educational programs that served both children and adults who were developing new skills and knowledge. Her house had become an informal learning center where people gathered for book discussions, research projects, and planning sessions that addressed various community initiatives. I never expected that getting older would mean becoming more useful rather than less useful, Mrs. Patterson explained as she shared homemade bread that had been baked using wheat grown on a community-supported farm. The young people value what I know about research and organization, while I'm learning from them about technology and sustainable farming methods that could help us become more self-sufficient. David Kim had returned to Millfield after working for several years in Boston's renewable energy industry, drawn by opportunities to implement innovative systems at community scale while maintaining connections to the place where he had grown up and learned values that had guided his career choices and personal development. I realized that I could contribute more to addressing climate change by helping create demonstration communities like Millfield than by working for large corporations that were mainly interested in profit rather than environmental and social impact. David explained as he described the community energy systems that he had helped design and install. Here, we can experiment with approaches that integrate technical innovation with social innovation to create models that other communities can adapt to their own circumstances. The renewable energy systems that David had helped develop included not just individual household installations, but community-scale projects that demonstrated how distributed energy generation could create local economic benefits while reducing environmental impact and enhancing energy security. The community owned and operated its electrical grid, selling excess power to neighboring towns, while maintaining independence from regional utilities that were controlled by distant corporations. After dinner, the community gathering shifted to discussion of current projects and challenges that required collaborative planning and decision-making. The conversation was facilitated by rotating volunteers who had learned group process skills that enabled productive discussion while ensuring that all voices were heard and all perspectives were considered in community planning. Sarah observed how the group addressed complex issues related to land use planning, economic development, education, healthcare, and environmental protection through processes that balanced individual interests with collective welfare while maintaining the voluntary participation and consensus decision-making that characterized effective mutual aid organizations. Community was planning construction of a community workshop facility that would provide shared access to tools and equipment that were too expensive for individual ownership, while creating space for skill-sharing activities and collaborative projects that served various household and community needs. The workshop would include traditional craft areas, as well as modern fabrication equipment that would enable local production of goods that were currently purchased from distant suppliers. We're trying to create what economists call import substitution by developing local capacity to produce things we need, rather than depending on global supply chains that are vulnerable to disruption and that don't provide economic benefits to our community, explained Maria Santos, a young entrepreneur who was developing a food processing business that would preserve and distribute vegetables from local farms while creating year-round employment for community members. The food processing facility represented the community's approach to economic development that prioritized local ownership and environmental sustainability while creating products that served regional markets and generated revenue that remained within the community rather than flowing to distant shareholders and investors. As the community gathering continued into the evening, Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing something remarkable, evidence that the mutual aid principles documented in the archive could be successfully scaled up to create comprehensive community development that addressed virtually every aspect of rural life while maintaining the voluntary participation and dignity preservation that characterized effective networks of care. The Millfield community had created innovations that went beyond individual assistance to include collaborative approaches to economic development, environmental protection, education, healthcare, housing, and cultural preservation that demonstrated how small communities could organize themselves according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility while maintaining connections to broader regional and global networks. Evening concluded with informal socializing and music making that revealed the community's commitment to cultural activities that strengthened social relationships while providing opportunities for creative expression and intergenerational learning. Several community members played traditional and contemporary music, while others shared poetry, stories, and other forms of artistic expression that reflected both individual creativity and collective values. As Emily drove Sarah back to her house through country roads, illuminated by a moon that was nearly full, she reflected on how the day had challenged her understanding of what community development could accomplish when it was guided by principles of mutual aid rather than individual competition or bureaucratic control. Tomorrow I'll show you some of our working landscapes and introduce you to people who are developing innovations in sustainable agriculture, forest management, and watershed protection, Emily said as they arrived at her house. We think you'll find it interesting to see how environmental stewardship can be integrated with community economic development to create approaches that serve both ecological health and human welfare. Sarah understood that Emily was offering her an opportunity to witness how the third generation of mutual aid practitioners was creating innovations that addressed contemporary Challenges related to climate change, economic inequality, and social isolation, while maintaining the essential principles that had made community networks effective across different historical periods and geographical contexts. The train journey through autumn landscape had been preparation for understanding that Millfield represented not just adaptation of mutual aid principles to rural circumstances, but evolution toward comprehensive community development that demonstrated alternatives to both urban isolation and rural decline that plagued many communities throughout the industrialized world. The fluorescent lights that had illuminated the basement archive had been replaced by solar-powered LED systems that provided the same quality illumination while reducing environmental impact and energy costs. But the essential purpose remained unchanged: preserving evidence that communities could organize themselves according to their highest values while creating practical solutions to challenges that affected everyone's quality of life and long-term prosperity. Sarah fell asleep in Emily's guest room to the sound of wind moving through maple trees that had been planted by farmers who had understood that their efforts to create productive and beautiful landscapes would benefit generations they would never meet. The continuity between past and present, between individual effort and collective benefit, between practical work and deeper values, seemed to characterize everything about Millfield. That made it an example of what rural communities could become when they organized themselves according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The archive had documented how communities could function according to their highest values, and Millfield was demonstrating how those values could be expressed through contemporary innovations that addressed current challenges while preserving the essential wisdom that enabled people to care for each other across generations, creating environments where everyone could flourish while contributing to the common good that sustained both individual welfare and collective prosperity. Asterisk. The morning mist rose from the valley floor like gentle spirits returning to the sky, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from chimneys where families were beginning their day with the unhurried rhythm that characterized life in places where people had learned to live according to the seasons rather than fighting against them. Sarah Chun stood at the edge of Millfield's community forest, watching the sunrise illuminate a landscape that had been shaped by generations of careful stewardship and thoughtful planning. Emily Foster had brought her here early, before the day's activities began, to witness what she called the community's morning meditation, a daily moment of quiet appreciation for the land that sustained them and the relationships that made their way of life possible. The forest stretched for several hundred acres, across hillsides that had been logged and farmed and logged again over the centuries, but that had been managed for the past 20 years according to principles that balanced human needs with ecological health. My great-grandfather helped clear these hills for pasture, Emily said quietly as they walked along a trail that wound between maple and birch trees, whose canopy filtered the early light into patterns that shifted and danced with every breath of wind. My grandfather planted these trees during the Depression when the federal government was paying farmers to reforest land that had been worn out by overuse. Now we're harvesting selectively to provide lumber and firewood while maintaining the forest as habitat and watershed protection. The community forest represented Millfield's approach to resource management that thought in terms of decades and centuries rather than quarterly profits and annual budgets. The trees were managed according to traditional forestry principles that had been refined through contemporary scientific understanding of forest ecology and climate change adaptation. The forest provided not just timber and firewood, but also maple syrup, wild medicinal plants, recreational opportunities, and essential ecosystem services that supported the community's long-term sustainability. As they walked deeper into the forest, Sarah began to understand that the trees were not just a resource but a teacher, demonstrating how individual organisms could thrive by contributing to larger systems that supported collective welfare over extended periods of time. The forest had become a metaphor for how human communities could organize themselves according to principles of mutual support and collective responsibility that created prosperity and security through cooperation rather than competition. Asterisk. We make most of our major community decisions here, Emily explained as they arrived at a circular clearing, where logs had been arranged to provide seating for groups of various sizes. There's something about being surrounded by living systems that have been growing and adapting for decades that helps people think about the long-term consequences of their choices and the importance of making decisions that serve not just current needs but future generations. The forest meeting space had been used for community planning sessions that had addressed challenges related to land use, economic development, education, and social services while maintaining the consensus decision-making processes that ensured all voices were heard and all perspectives were considered in collaborative problem-solving. Sarah found herself thinking about how the archive basement had served a similar function in her own journey of understanding, providing a space removed from daily pressures where patterns and principles could be recognized and appreciated for their deeper significance. The forest clearing represented evolution of that contemplative space, bringing community decision-making into direct contact with natural systems that demonstrated the patience and wisdom required for sustainable development. As the morning progressed, Emily guided Sarah through working landscapes that demonstrated how the community had integrated economic production with environmental stewardship and social development. The community-supported agriculture operation included not just vegetable gardens, but orchards, berry patches, herb gardens, and managed meadows that provided food, medicine, and habitat while creating educational opportunities for people of all ages to learn traditional and contemporary approaches to sustainable agriculture. The farm was managed by a collective of families who had pooled their resources and skills to create a diversified operation that served local food needs while providing livelihoods for several households. The agricultural work was organized according to principles of crop rotation, companion planting, and integrated pest management that had been developed through thousands of years of farming experience and refined through contemporary understanding of soil science and ecology. We produce about 60% of our community's food on land that also provides wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, water filtration, and educational opportunities, explained Marcus Johnson, a young farmer who had studied permaculture design and had helped develop the community's agricultural systems. The key insight is that farms can serve multiple functions simultaneously when they're designed according to ecological principles rather than industrial efficiency models. The diversified farming approach had created resilience against weather variations, pest outbreaks, and market fluctuations while providing community members with access to fresh, nutritious food that had been produced using methods that enhanced rather than degraded local environmental conditions. The farm had become a demonstration site that attracted visitors from other communities who were interested in developing their own approaches to sustainable agriculture and local food systems. Community workshop that Sarah had heard discussed at the previous evening's gathering was already under construction, using timber from the community forest and stone from a local quarry while incorporating renewable energy systems and energy-efficient design features that would minimize environmental impact while providing flexible space for various productive activities, the workshop construction, exemplified the community's approach to major projects. Collaborative efforts that served multiple functions while building local skills and strengthening social relationships. The building was being constructed primarily by community members who were learning traditional and contemporary building techniques while creating a facility that would serve collective needs for decades to come. We estimate that about 40 people will contribute labor to this project over the course of 6 months, explained Janet Martinez, a builder who had returned to Millfield after working in Boston's construction industry for several years. Everyone who participates learns skills that they can use for their own projects while contributing to a community resource that will benefit everyone. The building process is as important as the finished building because it strengthens the relationships and capabilities that make all our other projects possible. The workshop would house traditional craft activities like woodworking, metalsmithing, and textile production alongside contemporary fabrication equipment that would enable local production of goods that were currently purchased from distant suppliers. The facility would also serve as an educational center where skills could be shared across generations and where innovations could be developed and tested at community scale. As the afternoon continued, Sarah visited the Community Health Center, a modest facility that had been developed to address healthcare needs through integration of conventional medical services with traditional healing approaches and preventive care programs that addressed social determinants of health and wellness. The health center was staffed by a nurse practitioner who had been trained in both conventional medicine and traditional healing methods, supported by community members who had been trained to provide peer counseling, health education, and care coordination services that connected people with appropriate resources while maintaining the dignity and autonomy that characterized effective mutual aid systems. We found that health outcomes improve significantly when people have access to both clinical services and community support that addresses underlying factors like housing, nutrition, social connection, and meaningful work, explained Dr. Patricia Wong, the nurse practitioner who had helped design the community's integrated approach to health and wellness. Our model demonstrates that healthcare can be more effective and less expensive when it's embedded in communities where people care for each other's welfare as part of their daily lives. The health center's approach had produced measurable improvements in community health indicators while reducing dependence on expensive regional medical facilities and creating local employment for people who were trained to provide various types of health support services. The integration of conventional and traditional healing approaches had created options that served diverse cultural backgrounds and personal preferences while maintaining evidence-based standards for clinical care. The community school occupied a renovated 19th century building that had been expanded and upgraded to provide educational opportunities that served both children and adults while maintaining connections to place-based learning that used local resources and addressed community needs and interests. School's curriculum integrated traditional academic subjects with practical skills and community service activities that helped students understand their connections to the natural and social systems that sustained their community. Students learned mathematics through participation in farm planning and construction projects, developed literacy skills through documentation of community history and traditional knowledge, and explored science through hands-on investigation of local ecological and agricultural systems. Our graduates are prepared for higher education or career training, but they're also prepared to contribute to community life and to create meaningful work that serves local needs, explained Robert Kim, the principal who had helped develop the school's place-based approach to education. We found that students learn more effectively when their education connects to real-world applications and when they understand how their learning can contribute to community welfare. Asterisk, the school served not just local children but also attracted families from other areas who were interested in educational approaches that integrated academic achievement with character development and community engagement. The school had become a model for rural education that demonstrated alternatives to standardized testing and industrial education models that often failed to serve students' diverse learning needs and community development goals. As evening approached, Sarah joined Emily and several other community members for dinner at the home of Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian whose transportation needs had helped catalyze the formation of the mutual aid network 28 years earlier. Mrs. Patterson, now in her late 80s, continued to serve as an informal community historian and educator while receiving the support she needed to remain safely and comfortably in her own home. The dinner gathering included people of various ages and backgrounds who had chosen to make Millfield their home, representing the diversity of skills and perspectives that contributed to the community's resilience and vitality. The conversation revealed how different life experiences and professional backgrounds had been integrated into collaborative approaches to community development that served both individual aspirations and collective welfare. What strikes me most about living here, said Michael Chun, a software engineer who had moved to Millfield 2 years earlier after working remotely during the pandemic, had made him reconsider his priorities, is how normal it feels to care about your neighbor's welfare and to expect that they care about yours. In the city, I was surrounded by people but felt isolated from meaningful community. Here, I'm part of something larger than myself while maintaining my individual identity and interests. The dinner conversation touched on challenges and successes that had characterized the community's development over the past decades, revealing how problems had been addressed through collaborative problem solving and how opportunities had been pursued through coordinated action that balanced individual initiative with collective support. We've made mistakes and learned from them, acknowledged Dr. Martinez, who had helped establish the healthcare center and had witnessed the community's evolution through various stages of development. The key insight is that community development is an ongoing process of learning and adaptation rather than a destination that you arrive at and then maintain without continued effort and attention. As the evening progressed and Sarah prepared to return to Emily's house, she found herself reflecting on how her 3 days in Millfield had challenged and expanded her understanding of what communities could accomplish when they organized themselves according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The community represented an evolution of the mutual aid principles that had been documented in the archive, but it also represented something entirely new, comprehensive community development that demonstrated alternatives to both urban isolation and rural decline while addressing contemporary challenges related to climate change, economic inequality, and social fragmentation. Millfield had created innovations that integrated environmental stewardship with economic development, traditional wisdom with contemporary technology, individual autonomy with collective welfare, and local self-reliance with broader networks of connection and mutual support. Tomorrow morning, before you catch the train back to Boston, I want to show you one more thing, Emily said as they walked through the village center under stars that were visible in ways that urban residents rarely experienced. There's a project that we've been working on that might interest you as someone who has spent so many years documenting how communities can care for each other. Sarah understood that Emily was preparing to show her something that would complete her understanding of how the archive principles had evolved and adapted to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential commitment to demonstrating that human communities could organize themselves according to their highest values and most generous understanding of what collective life could become. The 3 days in Millfield had provided evidence that the mutual aid networks documented in the archive represented not just historical curiosities, but living principles that could guide community development that addressed complex contemporary challenges while creating environments where people could live with dignity, security, and hope for the future. The community forest that surrounded Millfield had become a metaphor for how human relationships could grow and develop over extended periods when they were tended with patience, wisdom, and commitment to collective welfare that balanced individual needs with long-term sustainability and environmental health. Standing in the forest clearing where community decisions were made through consensus processes that honored both human needs and ecological wisdom, Sarah had finally understood that the archive had never been about solving mysteries at all, but about documenting the eternal human capacity to create home together through countless acts of mutual care that demonstrated love was indeed more powerful than fear, cooperation more sustainable than competition, and communities more resilient. When they organized themselves according to principles that honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility for ensuring that everyone could flourish, while contributing to the common good that sustained both present welfare and future possibility. Asterisk, the morning air carried the scent of frost and apple wood smoke as Sarah Chun walked with Emily Foster along a path that led from the village center toward a hillside that overlooked the valley where Millfield had grown and flourished over the decades since the mutual aid networks had first taken root. The sun had not yet risen above the eastern ridge, but the sky was beginning to lighten with the gentle promise of another day in a place where time moved according to natural rhythms rather than human urgency. Emily carried a thermos of coffee and wore the expression of someone who was about to share something precious, something that had been carefully preserved and tended like the community forest or the heritage seed varieties that connected present gardeners to the wisdom of previous generations. She had been quiet during the short walk, allowing the landscape itself to speak about the careful attention that had shaped every aspect of this place where people had learned to live according to principles that honored both individual dignity and collective welfare. The path led to a terraced hillside that had been transformed into what Emily called the Memorial Garden, though Sarah could see no headstones or traditional markers that typically characterize such places. Instead, the terraces were filled with carefully arranged plantings that seemed to represent different themes and purposes, connected by stone pathways that invited contemplation while providing accessible routes for people with various mobility needs and preferences. "This is what I wanted to show you," Emily said as they paused at the garden's entrance, where a simple wooden sign explained that the space had been created to honor people who had dedicated their lives to caring for others, whose examples had inspired the community development that had made Millfield a demonstration of what mutual aid could accomplish when it was practiced consistently over extended periods. The garden had been designed as a living memorial that would continue to grow and evolve, providing food, medicine, beauty, and educational opportunities, while preserving the memory of people whose anonymous assistance and quiet dedication had created the foundation for everything that had followed. Each section of the garden represented different types of community service, different approaches to mutual care, and different generations of people who had contributed to the collective welfare that sustained individual prosperity and social cohesion. The first terrace was planted with herbs that had been used for healing by people who had provided informal health care and emotional support to their neighbors and community members. The plants included traditional medicinal species that had been cultivated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, alongside contemporary therapeutic plants that were being researched and developed by modern herbalists and healthcare practitioners. This section honors Mrs. Chun, who came here from Taiwan 50 years ago and taught us about traditional Chinese medicine. Emily explained as they walked among plantings of ginseng, astragalus, and other herbs that required years of patient cultivation before they could be harvested. She provided healing and health education for decades before the community health center was established, and she trained several people to continue her work after she passed away. The medicinal garden demonstrated how traditional knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across generations, while being integrated with contemporary understanding of healthcare and wellness. The plants were tended by community members who had been trained in their cultivation and use, ensuring that the healing knowledge would continue to serve future generations while honoring the memory of people who had dedicated their lives to caring for others' health and well-being. The second terrace contained vegetables and fruits that represented the food security work that had enabled the community to develop sustainable agriculture and local food systems. The plantings included heritage varieties that had been preserved by seed savers who understood that genetic diversity was essential for long-term agricultural resilience, alongside contemporary cultivars that had been developed to address changing climate conditions and evolving nutritional needs. Asterisk. This area honors Mr. Davies, the blacksmith who taught us traditional food preservation methods, Emily said as they paused beside raised beds that were filled with storage crops like potatoes, carrots, and winter squash. He understood that food security required not just growing food, but preserving it through seasonal cycles, and he taught several families the skills they needed to maintain nutritious diets year-round using local resources. The Food Security Garden provided ongoing education about sustainable agriculture, while honoring the memory of people who had ensured that community members had access to nutritious food, regardless of their economic circumstances or individual gardening skills. The garden served as both memorial and practical resource, demonstrating how remembrance could be integrated with ongoing service to community welfare. The third terrace was planted with trees and shrubs that represented the environmental stewardship work that had enabled the community to develop sustainable relationships with the natural systems that supported all life in the region. The plantings included native species that provided habitat for wildlife alongside fruit and nut trees that would provide food for future generations while sequestering carbon and preventing soil erosion. This section honors Mrs. Foster, my grandmother, who understood that caring for the land was inseparable from caring for people, Emily said as they stood beneath apple trees that had been grafted with heritage varieties that connected present orchardists to the agricultural wisdom of previous centuries. She taught us that environmental protection and community development were not separate goals, but different aspects of the same commitment to ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where they could live with dignity and security. The Environmental Stewardship Garden demonstrated how human communities could enhance rather than degrade natural systems when they organized their activities according to ecological principles and long-term thinking. The plantings were selected and arranged to provide multiple benefits over extended time periods, creating habitat, food, medicine, and beauty while demonstrating sustainable relationships between human needs and ecological health. The fourth terrace contained plants that represented the educational work that had enabled the community to develop learning systems that served both children and adults while preserving traditional knowledge and fostering innovation that addressed contemporary challenges. The plantings included flowers and herbs that were used for natural dyes and craft materials, alongside species that demonstrated various ecological relationships and agricultural techniques. This area honors Mr. Patterson, the retired teacher who helped develop our place-based education programs, Emily explained as they walked among plantings that illustrated various scientific principles and historical relationships. He understood that education was most effective when it connected to real-world applications and when it helped people understand their place in larger systems that required their care and attention. The educational garden provided ongoing learning opportunities, while honoring the memory of people who had dedicated their lives to helping others, develop knowledge and skills that served both individual growth and community welfare. The garden served as an outdoor classroom where people of all ages could learn about natural systems, traditional techniques, and contemporary innovations that enhanced their capacity to contribute to collective prosperity. The fifth terrace was planted with flowers and ornamental plants that represented the cultural and artistic work that had created beauty and meaning in community life. The plantings included species that were used for ceremonies and celebrations, alongside plants that provided materials for various forms of artistic expression and cultural preservation. This section honors Mrs. Martinez, the musician who organized our community celebrations and taught traditional songs to several generations of children. Emily said as they paused beside beds that contained flowers traditionally used for festivals and ceremonial occasions. She understood that community life required not just practical cooperation but also shared experiences of beauty and joy that connected people to larger meanings and purposes. The cultural garden demonstrated how artistic expression and ceremonial life contributed to community cohesion while honoring the memory of people who had dedicated their lives to creating experiences that enriched the spiritual and emotional dimensions of collective life. The garden provided materials for ongoing cultural activities while serving as a reminder that mutual aid included not just practical assistance, but also opportunities for celebration and creative expression. As they reached the highest terrace, Sarah discovered that the memorial garden concluded with a meditation space that overlooked the entire valley where Millfield had developed into a demonstration of what communities could accomplish when they organized themselves according to principles of mutual care and collective responsibility. The space included simple benches arranged to provide views of the working landscapes that sustained the community while creating opportunities for quiet reflection and contemplation. We come here when we need to remember why we're doing this work, Emily said as they settled onto one of the benches and watched the sunrise illuminate the village center. The agricultural fields, the community forest, and the various projects that demonstrated how human settlements could enhance, rather than degrade, the natural and social systems that supported all life. Sarah understood that the memorial garden represented something profound, recognition that mutual aid was not just a practical approach to community development, but a spiritual practice that connected people to larger meanings and purposes that transcended individual lifespans and personal interests. The garden honored people who had understood that caring for others was a form of devotion, a way of participating in something sacred that continued beyond individual death and transformed into ongoing blessing for future generations. The garden grows and changes every year as we add new plantings and as existing plants mature and spread, Emily explained as they sat in comfortable silence, while the valley awakened to another day of productive work and community cooperation. We don't maintain individual graves here, but we believe that the people we honor would appreciate being remembered through living systems that continue to provide for community welfare long after their individual contributions have been completed. The memorial garden represented evolution of human remembrance that integrated individual honor with collective welfare, personal memory with ongoing service, traditional commemoration with contemporary understanding of ecological relationships and social sustainability. The garden demonstrated how communities could preserve the memory of their benefactors while continuing to benefit from their wisdom and dedication through living systems that grew more valuable and beautiful with each passing Season. As the morning progressed and it came time for Sarah to return to the train station for her journey back to the city, she understood that her visit to Millfield had provided more than just a documentation of how mutual aid principles could be adapted to rural circumstances. She had witnessed evidence that such principles could create comprehensive alternatives to the social isolation and environmental degradation that characterized many contemporary communities, demonstrating that human settlements could be organized according to values that created prosperity through cooperation rather than competition. Memorial Garden had provided the culminating insight that transformed her understanding of what the Teofado archive had been documenting throughout the decades since she had first encountered those mysterious police reports in the basement filing cabinets. The anonymous assistants that had puzzled investigating officers had never been mysterious at all, but had been expressions of the fundamental human capacity to create meaning through service to others, to find purpose through contribution to collective welfare, and to achieve a form of immortality through the ongoing benefits that individual kindness created for community life. The people honored in the Memorial Garden had understood that love creates its own monuments, that caring for others generates its own rewards, and that communities organized according to principles of mutual aid become living memorials to everyone who chooses to contribute to the common good that sustains both individual dignity and collective prosperity. Standing in the Memorial Garden that overlooked a valley where people had learned to live according to their highest values, Sarah finally understood that the archive had been documenting not just individual acts of kindness, but evidence of the eternal human capacity to create home together through countless expressions of mutual care that demonstrated the fundamental truth that individual welfare and collective health were not separate concerns, but different aspects of the same understanding of what it meant to be fully human. The train journey back to Boston provided time for Sarah to reflect on how her individual journey of discovery had been transformed into recognition that mutual aid was not just a practical approach to community development, but a spiritual practice that connected people to the deepest sources of meaning and purpose that made life worth living and communities worth preserving for future generations. The Memorial Garden would continue to grow and provide for community welfare long after Emily and her generation had been honored through their own contributions to the ongoing demonstration that human communities could organize themselves according to principles that created environments where everyone could flourish, while contributing to the common good that sustained both present welfare and future possibility. The archive had documented the beginning of that demonstration, and Millfield had shown what it could become when practiced consistently across generations by people who understood that caring for others was not an obligation but a privilege, not a burden but a joy, not a mystery but the most natural expression of what it meant to live in community with others who shared commitment to ensuring that love would always be more powerful than fear, cooperation more sustainable than competition, and mutual care more effective than individual struggle for creating the conditions where everyone could live with dignity, security, and hope for the future. Detective Sarah Chun sat at her kitchen table as the October evening settled into darkness around her city apartment, surrounded by notebooks and photographs that documented her 3 days in Millfield, but struggling to find words that could capture what she had witnessed without diminishing its significance through inadequate description. The Memorial Garden had provided such a complete understanding of what mutual aid could become that she felt both satisfied by the journey's completion and challenged by the responsibility to share what she had learned with communities that might benefit from knowing that such alternatives were possible. The letter she was writing to Margaret Sullivan would be the first of many that would carry news of Millfield's innovations to the global network of communities that had been inspired by the archive discoveries. But as she worked to describe Emily Foster's generation and their comprehensive approach to rural sustainability, Sarah began to understand that the real significance of her visit lay not in documenting another successful implementation of mutual aid principles, but in recognizing how those principles continued to evolve and adapt to address challenges that required new forms of cooperation and collective creativity. The young people of Millfield had grown up, taking mutual care for granted, had absorbed principles of community responsibility as naturally as they had learned to walk and speak, and were now creating innovations that demonstrated how human settlements could be organized according to ecological wisdom and social justice that their grandparents' generation had only begun to imagine. They represented hope that the archive principles could be transmitted across generations while continuing to develop new applications and deeper understanding. Sarah's letter described how Emily's generation had integrated environmental stewardship with economic development, how they had created educational systems that honored both traditional knowledge and contemporary innovation, how they had developed governance structures that balanced individual autonomy with collective decision-making, and how they had established cultural practices that celebrated both diversity and shared commitment to community welfare. The Memorial Garden, Sarah wrote, represents something unprecedented in my experience, a way of honoring the past that continues to serve the future, a form of remembrance that creates ongoing benefits rather than simply preserving static memories. The people honored there would be amazed to see how their individual acts of kindness have grown into comprehensive community development that addresses virtually every aspect of sustainable living. As she continued writing, Sarah began to understand that her letter was becoming more than just documentation of Millfield's innovations. It was becoming a meditation on how individual actions could create ripple effects that expanded across generations and geographical boundaries, connecting communities that shared commitment to, demonstrating that human societies could organize themselves according to their highest values while addressing practical challenges that required both technical innovation and social cooperation. The letter described how Millfield had become a destination for visitors from around the world who came to study rural sustainability, but also how the community had maintained its essential character as a place where people lived ordinary lives according to extraordinary principles of mutual care and collective responsibility. The innovations had emerged from daily practice rather than theoretical planning, from patient attention to local conditions rather than imposition of external models. What strikes me most, Sarah wrote, is how normal it all feels to the people who live there. They don't consider themselves to be creating utopia or demonstrating revolutionary alternatives to mainstream society. They're simply living according to values that they learned from observing their parents and grandparents, adapting those values to contemporary circumstances while maintaining the essential understanding that individual welfare and community health are inseparable. The letter continued with descriptions of specific innovations that other communities might adapt to their own circumstances. The circular economy approaches that minimized waste while creating local employment, the renewable energy systems that provided independence while reducing environmental impact, the consensus decision-making processes that honored diverse perspectives while maintaining collective effectiveness, and the cultural practices that strengthened social relationships while celebrating individual creativity and expression. But as Sarah wrote about these practical innovations, she began to understand that the most important thing she had learned in Millfield could not be easily replicated through technical copying or programmatic implementation. The community's success depended on relationships and values that had been developed through decades of patient practice, through countless small decisions to prioritize collective welfare over individual advantage. through daily choices to care for others, even when such caring required personal sacrifice or inconvenience. The letter became an exploration of how communities could create conditions that enabled such relationships and values to develop over time. How mutual aid principles could be introduced and practiced in ways that allowed them to take root and flourish according to local conditions and cultural preferences. Sarah found herself writing not just about what Millfield had accomplished, but about how other communities might begin their own journeys toward comprehensive approaches to sustainable development and social cooperation. The key insight, Sarah wrote, is that community development is not a destination, but a process. Not a project, but a way of life that requires ongoing attention and commitment from people who understand that their individual prosperity depends on collective welfare and environmental health. Millfield represents what becomes possible when people practice mutual aid consistently over extended periods. But every community must discover its own path toward such possibilities. As the evening progressed and the letter grew longer, Sarah began to understand that she was documenting not just Millfield's innovations, but her own transformation from someone who investigated mysteries to someone who recognized that the deepest mysteries were actually simple truths about human nature that became visible when people organized their lives according to principles of love and cooperation rather than fear and competition. Letter described how the memorial garden had provided the culminating insight that individual acts of kindness could create lasting benefits that continued to serve community welfare long after the original helpers had died. That anonymous assistance was not exceptional behavior, but normal expression of human capacity for creating meaning through service to others, and that communities organized according to mutual aid principles became living demonstrations of what society could achieve when it operated according to its highest values. Standing in that garden overlooking the valley where people had learned to live according to principles of mutual care, Sarah wrote, I finally understood that the archive had never been about solving crimes or explaining mysteries, but about documenting evidence that human beings are capable of remarkable generosity and wisdom when they remember that caring for others is not an obligation but a privilege, not a burden but a joy, not a mystery but the most natural expression of what it means to be fully human. The letter concluded with Sarah's recognition that her individual journey of discovery had connected her to a global community of people who shared commitment to demonstrating that alternatives to social isolation and environmental degradation were not just possible but practical and sustainable when communities understood what was required and committed themselves to the patient work of creating environments where everyone could flourish while contributing to collective welfare. The archive will continue to serve as evidence that such communities are possible. Sarah wrote, but Millfield has shown me that the real archive is not contained in basement filing cabinets, but in the living relationships and ongoing practices that connect people to each other and to the natural systems that sustain all life. Every community has the capacity to create its own archive of mutual care, its own demonstration that love is more powerful than fear and cooperation more sustainable than competition. As Sarah sealed the letter and prepared it for mailing, she understood that it would travel much further than Margaret Sullivan's address, that it would be copied and shared with communities around the world that were working to implement their own approaches to mutual aid and sustainable development. The letter would become part of the ongoing documentation that connected isolated experiments in community development to a larger movement of people who were committed to creating alternatives to the social and environmental problems that characterize contemporary civilization. The letter represented Sarah's contribution to the archive that was no longer contained in basement filing cabinets, but was being written in communities around the world that were demonstrating that human societies could organize themselves according to principles of mutual care and collective responsibility, that created environments where everyone could live with dignity and security while contributing to the common good that sustained both individual welfare and collective prosperity. The evening had grown late, but Sarah found herself energized rather than tired by the work of transforming her Millfield experience into words that could travel to other places and inspire other people to believe that such communities were possible in their own circumstances and contexts. The letter had become more than documentation. It had become an act of mutual aid itself, a way of sharing resources and insights that could benefit communities she would never visit and people she would never meet. The archive had taught her that anonymous assistance was the foundation of healthy communities, and now she was participating in that assistance by sharing evidence that comprehensive alternatives to social isolation and environmental degradation were not just theoretical possibilities, but practical realities that had been tested and refined through decades of patient practice and continuous adaptation to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. Memorial Garden that overlooked Millfield had demonstrated how individual acts of kindness could create lasting benefits that continued to serve community welfare across generations. And Sarah's letter represented her own contribution to that ongoing legacy of care and service that connected past wisdom to future possibility through present action that honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility for ensuring that everyone could flourish while contributing to the common good. As she turned off the lights in her apartment and prepared for sleep, Sarah understood that her journey from the basement archive to the Memorial Garden had been completed, but that the work of sharing what she had learned would continue for as long as communities needed evidence that alternatives to fear and competition were possible, that people could learn to live according to principles that created safety and security through cooperation rather than control, and that love could indeed become the organizing principle for human societies that were committed to creating environments where everyone could live with dignity, hope, and meaningful connection to others who shared responsibility for maintaining the conditions that enabled individual and collective flourishing. The letter would begin its own journey the next morning, carrying with it the quiet certainty that what had been possible in one small Vermont town could bloom anywhere. People chose to remember what home truly meant when it was created through mutual care and collective commitment to ensuring that no one faced life's challenges alone, that everyone had opportunities to contribute their gifts to community welfare, and that the future could be different from the past when people understood their capacity to create the changes they wanted to see in the world. Asterisk. The response letters began arriving in December, carried by winter mail that brought news from communities scattered across continents and climates, each envelope containing stories of how Sarah's description of Millfield had inspired local adaptations of mutual aid principles that reflected both universal human values and specific cultural circumstances. Detective Sarah Chun found herself becoming an accidental coordinator of global correspondence that connected isolated experiments in community development to a larger understanding of what was possible when people committed themselves to caring for each other across differences of geography, language, and economic circumstance. The first letter had come from a neighborhood in Detroit where residents had been organizing urban agriculture projects that provided fresh food while creating opportunities for skill sharing and community building among families who had been struggling with unemployment and disinvestment. The Millfield innovations had provided practical ideas for developing consensus decision-making processes and resource-sharing systems that could strengthen their existing efforts while expanding their scope to address housing, education, and healthcare challenges. Your description of the memorial garden has inspired us to create our own space for honoring the elders and activists who built the foundation. For our current work, wrote Maria Santos, a community organizer who had been working in Detroit's East Side for 15 years. We're planning a community orchard that will provide fruit while serving as a living memorial to people whose organizing and mutual support created the conditions that make our current projects possible. The Detroit community had adapted Millfield's circular economy principles to urban circumstances, developing systems for sharing tools and equipment, coordinating bulk purchasing of household necessities, and creating informal childcare networks that enabled parents to pursue education and employment opportunities, while ensuring that children received consistent care and attention from multiple community members who understood their individual needs and family circumstances. The letter described how the community had developed approaches to home weatherization and energy efficiency that combined volunteer labor with technical expertise, enabling low-income residents to reduce utility costs while learning practical skills that could be applied to other housing improvement projects. The work had created opportunities for intergenerational learning while strengthening social relationships that supported community resilience and collective problem-solving. Second letter had arrived from a fishing village in Nova Scotia where climate change was disrupting traditional livelihoods while creating opportunities for innovation in sustainable ocean resource management. The community had been inspired by Millfield's approach to environmental stewardship that balanced human needs with ecological health, adapting those principles to marine ecosystems and coastal community development. Asterisk. We've been working to develop community-controlled fisheries management that ensures sustainable harvests while maintaining the cultural traditions that connect our families to this place, wrote Robert McLeod, a fisherman whose family had worked these waters for 4 generations. The Millfield model has helped us understand how traditional knowledge and contemporary science can be integrated to create approaches that serve both environmental protection and community economic development. The fishing community had organized cooperative marketing systems that enabled independent fishermen to receive fair prices for their catches while building direct relationships with consumers who valued sustainably harvested seafood. The cooperatives had created economic stability while enabling the community to maintain control over their traditional fishing grounds rather than losing access to industrial fishing operations controlled by distant corporations. Letter described how the community had developed storm preparedness and mutual aid systems that reflected both their maritime culture and contemporary understanding of climate change adaptation. The systems included community-owned emergency equipment, coordinated response protocols that utilized local knowledge and skills, and recovery assistance that enabled families to rebuild after storms while strengthening community infrastructure and resilience. A third letter had come from a small city in Germany where immigrants from various countries had been working to create inclusive community development that honored cultural diversity while building shared commitment to mutual aid and social cooperation. The community had been particularly inspired by Millfield's approach to consensus decision-making that respected different perspectives while maintaining collective effectiveness. Your description of how different generations learn to work together despite their different experiences and priorities has helped us understand how people from different cultural backgrounds can create community while maintaining their individual identities, wrote Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, a refugee services coordinator who had helped establish intercultural dialogue programs were developing approaches to community mediation and conflict resolution that build on traditional practices from various cultures while creating new forms of cooperation that serve our contemporary circumstances. The German community had created language exchange programs that enabled immigrants to develop German language skills while sharing their own languages and cultural knowledge with longer-term residents who were interested in building cross-cultural relationships and understanding. The exchanges had created social connections that supported both practical integration and cultural preservation while strengthening community capacity for addressing challenges that affected people from all backgrounds. The letter described how the community had developed shared workshop spaces where traditional crafts from various cultures were taught and practiced alongside contemporary skills like computer literacy and small business development. The workshops had created opportunities for economic development while preserving cultural knowledge and creating intergenerational connections that strengthened community social fabric. As the correspondence continued through the winter months, Sarah began to understand that her letter about Millfield had become part of a growing network of communities that were sharing innovations and supporting each other's efforts to implement principles of mutual aid and sustainable development. The letters revealed how different communities were adapting similar principles to diverse circumstances while maintaining their commitment to collective welfare and individual dignity. Letter from a rural community in Kenya described how traditional practices of community cooperation were being revitalized and adapted to address contemporary challenges related to water management, sustainable agriculture, and education development. The community had been inspired by Millfield's approach to skill sharing that honored elder knowledge while encouraging innovation among younger community members. The memorial garden concept has helped us understand how to honor our ancestors while creating ongoing benefits for current and future generations, wrote Grace Wanjiku, a teacher who had been working to develop community-controlled education programs. We're creating medicinal plant gardens that preserve traditional healing knowledge while providing resources for community health programs that integrate traditional and contemporary approaches to wellness. The Kenyan community had developed water conservation and management systems that combine traditional techniques with contemporary technology, creating reliable access to clean water while maintaining community control over this essential resource. The systems had enabled agricultural development while reducing dependence on distant urban centers for employment and economic opportunity. A letter from Aboriginal communities in Australia described how traditional practices of caring for country were being integrated with contemporary conservation science to create innovative approaches to environmental stewardship that served both ecological health and cultural preservation. The communities had been inspired by Millfield's demonstration that environmental protection and community economic development could be pursued simultaneously through careful attention to ecological relationships and traditional knowledge. Your description of how young people learn to care for the land by watching their elders has reminded us of the importance of maintaining our own traditional teaching methods while adapting them to contemporary circumstances, wrote David Namachira, a cultural educator who had been working to develop programs that connected young Aboriginal people to traditional land management practices. We're creating cultural learning centers that demonstrate how traditional ecological knowledge can address contemporary environmental challenges while maintaining our spiritual and cultural connections to country. The Australian communities had developed tourism and education programs that enabled them to share traditional knowledge while maintaining cultural protocols and generating economic benefits that supported community development and cultural preservation. The programs had created opportunities for young people to develop careers that honored traditional culture while addressing contemporary Economic needs. As spring arrived and the correspondence continued to expand, Sarah began to understand that the global network of communities was creating something unprecedented, a practical demonstration that mutual aid principles could be successfully adapted to virtually any cultural context or geographical circumstance while maintaining their essential commitment to collective welfare and individual dignity. The letters revealed how communities were developing innovations in sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, community governance, education, healthcare, economic development, and cultural preservation that reflected both local wisdom and universal human values. The diversity of approaches demonstrated that mutual aid was not a single model to be copied, but a set of principles that could inspire countless variations and adaptations according to local conditions and community preferences. A letter from an urban neighborhood in São Paulo described how residents had organized comprehensive community development that addressed housing, education, healthcare, and public safety through cooperative approaches that strengthened social relationships while improving material conditions. The community had been inspired by Millfield's integration of environmental stewardship with social development, adapting those principles to dense urban circumstances and complex social challenges. We've learned that community safety comes from people caring for each other rather than from external policing or security measures, wrote Carlos Silva, a community organizer who had been working to develop alternatives to traditional approaches to crime prevention. The mutual aid networks have created environments where people feel connected and responsible for each other's welfare, which has reduced both crime and fear while improving quality of life for everyone. The São Paulo community had developed community-controlled economic development that included cooperative businesses, shared ownership of housing and community facilities, and alternative currency systems that kept economic benefits within the community rather than flowing to distant investors. The economic development had created opportunities for local entrepreneurship while strengthening community self-reliance and collective capacity for addressing various challenges. As summer approached and the correspondence network continued to expand, Sarah began to receive invitations to visit communities that wanted to share their innovations while learning from her experience documenting mutual aid principles and their various applications. The invitations represented opportunities to witness how the archive principles had continued to evolve and adapt while inspiring new generations of people who were committed to demonstrating that alternatives to social isolation and environmental degradation were possible in virtually any circumstances. The correspondence had transformed Sarah's understanding of her role from documenting past innovations to facilitating ongoing communication among communities that were creating contemporary demonstrations of what human societies could accomplish when they organized themselves according to principles of mutual care and collective responsibility. The archive had become a living network that continued to grow and develop through sharing of practical innovations and successful adaptations. The basement filing cabinets that had originally contained mysterious police reports had evolved into a global communication system that connected communities on every continent who were working to implement their own approaches to sustainable development and social cooperation. The archive had become what it had always been documenting, a form of assistance that appeared wherever it was needed most, providing communities with evidence that alternatives were possible and practical guidance for creating their own innovations. As Sarah prepared to respond to the latest batch of letters, she understood that her individual journey from investigating mysteries to facilitating community connections had become part of something much larger, a global movement of people who were committed to demonstrating that human societies could organize themselves according to their highest values while addressing practical challenges that required both technical innovation and social cooperation. The Correspondence Network represented proof that the principles documented in the archive were not historical artifacts but living practices that could continue to evolve. and adapt to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential commitment to creating environments where everyone could flourish, while contributing to collective welfare and environmental health. The letters would continue to travel around the world, carrying with them stories of innovation and adaptation that inspired new communities to believe that mutual aid was possible in their own circumstances, that people could learn to care for each other across differences of culture and geography, and that love could indeed become the organizing principle for human societies that were committed to creating alternatives to fear and competition through patient practice of cooperation and collective responsibility for ensuring that everyone could live with dignity, security, and hope for the future. Asterisk Detective Sarah Chun adjusted her computer screen as faces from around the world appeared in the video conference grid, each representing a community that had been transformed by principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility that had traveled far beyond the basement archive where her journey had begun 30 years earlier. The technology that enabled this global gathering would have seemed miraculous to the police officers who had first documented mysterious acts of anonymous assistance, but the purpose of their connection would have been immediately familiar. People sharing knowledge about how to care for each other more effectively. The conference had been organized by Emily Foster, now in her 40s and serving as coordinator of the Global Mutual Aid Network that had emerged from the correspondence that had begun with Sarah's letter about Millfield. Emily had moved to Geneva to work with international development organizations while maintaining her connections to the Vermont community that had shaped her understanding of what human settlements could accomplish when they operated according to principles of cooperation and environmental stewardship. "Welcome, everyone, to our quarterly check-in," Emily said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority that had characterized her grandmother Helen Foster, one of the original recipients of anonymous assistance whose memory was honored in Millfield's Memorial Garden. "I know we're spread across different time zones, so I especially appreciate those of you who are joining us during your evening or early morning hours." The video grid revealed the remarkable diversity of the global network. Maria Santos calling from Detroit, where her neighborhood had become a model for urban regeneration. Robert MacLeod joining from Nova Scotia, where the fishing cooperative had inspired coastal communities throughout the maritime provinces. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid participating from Berlin, where intercultural mutual aid programs had influenced German immigration policy. Grace Wanjiku connecting from Nairobi, where community-controlled education initiatives had spread throughout East Africa. Sarah found herself marveling at how the conference technology enabled real-time communication among people who shared commitment to values that transcended cultural boundaries and geographical distances. The participants represented communities that had adapted mutual aid principles to circumstances ranging from Arctic fishing villages to tropical agricultural cooperatives, from dense urban neighborhoods to remote rural settlements, from refugee resettlement programs to indigenous cultural preservation projects. David Namachira appeared on screen from the Australian outback, where traditional Aboriginal land management practices were being integrated with contemporary conservation science to create innovative approaches to environmental stewardship that served both ecological health and cultural preservation. His weathered face reflected decades of outdoor work, but his eyes carried the brightness of someone who had found meaningful ways to bridge traditional wisdom with contemporary challenges. Our cultural learning centers have been hosting visitors from Aboriginal communities across Australia and New Zealand. David reported during the session devoted to sharing recent developments and innovations. "We're developing exchange programs that enable different groups to share traditional knowledge while learning from each other's approaches to caring for country in contemporary circumstances." The Aboriginal programs had become models for how Indigenous communities could maintain cultural autonomy while engaging with broader society on terms that honored traditional values and knowledge systems. The land management practices had demonstrated how traditional ecological knowledge could address contemporary environmental challenges more effectively than purely technical approaches that ignored cultural and spiritual relationships with natural systems. Carlos Silva joined the conference from São Paulo, where his neighborhood had become a demonstration site for community-controlled urban development that addressed housing, education, healthcare, and public safety through cooperative approaches that strengthened social relationships while improving material conditions for families who had been marginalized by conventional economic development strategies. We've been working with municipal government to develop policies that support community self-organization rather than requiring bureaucratic oversight of every local initiative, Carlos explained during discussion of how communities could work with formal institutions while maintaining their autonomy and effectiveness. The key insight is that government can be most helpful when it creates enabling conditions rather than trying to control or replace informal networks of mutual support. The São Paulo innovations had influenced urban policy throughout Brazil and had attracted attention from city planners and community development specialists who were seeking alternatives to top-down approaches that often failed to address local needs and priorities, while undermining existing social resources and cultural practices. Dr. Chun Wei appeared on screen from Shanghai, where rapid urbanization had created challenges for maintaining community relationships and cultural traditions among families who had moved from rural areas to dense urban environments. Her community had adapted mutual aid principles to high-rise apartment living, while creating innovative approaches to intergenerational care and urban agriculture that served both practical and cultural needs. We've developed rooftop garden systems that enable apartment dwellers to grow vegetables and herbs, while creating social spaces where different generations can share knowledge about traditional cultivation methods. Dr. Chun reported, "The gardens provide food security while preserving cultural knowledge and creating opportunities for community building in environments that could otherwise be quite isolating." The Shanghai innovations had demonstrated how mutual aid principles could be adapted to contemporary urban circumstances that seemed challenging for community development, inspiring similar programs in other rapidly growing cities throughout Asia, where traditional social structures were being transformed by economic and demographic changes. As the conference continued through reports from different regions, Sarah began to understand that the global network represented something unprecedented in human history, a voluntary association of communities that were sharing innovations and supporting each other's efforts to implement alternatives to social isolation and environmental degradation without requiring formal organization or bureaucratic coordination. Professor Linda Martinez joined from Stockholm, where she had been working with Scandinavian governments to develop policies that supported community resilience and social cooperation, while maintaining democratic institutions and individual rights. Her research had documented how mutual aid principles could strengthen, rather than replace formal social services, while reducing costs and improving outcomes for people who needed various types of assistance. The key finding from our research is that informal networks of care are most effective when they're supported by rather than replaced by official programs. Professor Martinez explained during discussion of how communities could work with government institutions. Communities possess remarkable capacities for addressing their own challenges when they're given resources and recognition rather than bureaucratic oversight and control. The Scandinavian research had influenced social policy throughout Northern Europe and had provided evidence that mutual aid was not incompatible with democratic governance and social welfare systems, but could enhance their effectiveness while reducing dependence on bureaucratic institutions that often failed to provide adequate attention to individual circumstances and community preferences. Dr. Amara Okafor appeared from Lagos, where post-conflict reconstruction efforts had been guided by traditional practices of community cooperation and contemporary understanding of sustainable development. Her work had demonstrated how communities could rebuild social fabric and economic infrastructure simultaneously through approaches that honored cultural values while addressing contemporary challenges. We've learned that reconstruction is most successful when it builds on existing social resources rather than imposing external models, Dr. Okafor reported. Communities that maintain their traditional practices of mutual support are more resilient and better able to adapt to changing circumstances than those that become dependent on external assistance and technical solutions. The West African innovations had influenced post-conflict reconstruction throughout the region and had provided models for how communities could maintain cultural identity while adapting to contemporary economic and political circumstances that required new forms of organization and cooperation. As the conference moved through different agenda items, Sarah began to understand that the participants represented more than just successful implementations of mutual aid principles. They represented evidence that human communities possessed remarkable capacities for innovation and adaptation when they were guided by values that prioritized collective welfare and individual dignity, while maintaining connections to traditional wisdom and contemporary knowledge. The discussion of challenges revealed how different communities were addressing similar problems through locally appropriate innovations that reflected both universal human values and specific cultural circumstances. Climate change adaptation, economic inequality, social isolation, cultural preservation, and environmental protection were being addressed through approaches that integrated traditional knowledge with contemporary technology while maintaining community control over decision-making and resource allocation. Elena Rodriguez joined from Barcelona, where the European Mutual Aid Network had been documenting successful community development initiatives throughout the continent while advocating for policies that supported local self-organization and sustainable development. Her work had helped establish connections among communities that were implementing similar principles in different cultural and economic contexts. We're seeing remarkable convergence around certain principles and practices despite the diversity of cultural backgrounds and local circumstances, Elena reported during discussion of emerging patterns and shared learning opportunities. Communities that prioritize voluntary participation, dignity preservation, and collective responsibility tend to develop similar approaches to problem solving, even when they have no direct contact with each other. The European network had become a model for how regional cooperation could support local autonomy, while enabling communities to share resources and innovations that enhance their individual and collective capacity for addressing various challenges and opportunities. As the conference approached its conclusion, Emily invited participants to share reflections on how the global network had influenced their local work while asking what kinds of support and connection would be most helpful for their ongoing efforts to implement and refine mutual aid approaches to community development. The responses revealed how the network had provided both practical resources and emotional support for people who were working to create alternatives to conventional approaches to social organization that often failed to address human needs for community connection and meaningful participation in collective welfare. Knowing that similar work is happening around the world has given us confidence to continue experimenting with approaches that might seem unrealistic to people who haven't experienced what communities can accomplish when they organize themselves according to principles of mutual care, reflected Grace Wanjiku from Nairobi. The network has helped us understand that we're not trying to create something entirely new, but rather adapting principles that have guided human cooperation throughout history to contemporary circumstances that require new applications of ancient wisdom, added David Namakjira from Australia. As the conference concluded and participants began signing off to return to their local work and daily routines, Sarah understood that she had witnessed something remarkable, evidence that human communities could organize themselves according to principles that created environments where everyone could flourish while contributing to collective welfare. and that such communities could maintain their effectiveness and appeal across diverse cultural contexts in challenging circumstances. The global network represented evolution of the mutual aid principles that had been documented in the archive, but it also represented something entirely new: voluntary cooperation on a planetary scale among communities that shared commitment to demonstrating that alternatives to fear and competition were possible wherever people chose to remember that caring for others was the foundation of meaningful human community. The technology that enabled the conference had been used for the most ancient purpose, helping people remember how to care for each other across differences of geography, culture, and circumstance while maintaining their individual identity and local autonomy. The network had become a living demonstration that love could indeed become the organizing principle for human societies that were committed to creating environments where everyone could live with dignity, security, and hope for the future. As Sarah closed her computer and returned to her evening routine, she understood that the conference had been more than just communication among distant communities. It had been evidence that the archive principles had evolved into something that could address the most pressing challenges of contemporary civilization, while maintaining their essential commitment to the simple truth that people could learn to live together according to their highest values when they understood that individual welfare and collective health were not separate concerns, but different aspects of the same fundamental understanding of what it meant to be fully human. Detective Sarah Chun, now retired for more than a decade, but still carrying the title that had opened doors to understanding she could never have imagined, stood once again in the basement archive that had become a pilgrimage destination for people from around the world who came to witness the place where the documentation of human kindness had begun. The fluorescent lights had been replaced with energy-efficient LED systems. The climate control had been upgraded to protect the historical documents, and the filing cabinets had been supplemented with digital systems that made the archives contents accessible to researchers and practitioners globally. But the essential atmosphere remained unchanged, a quiet sanctuary where evidence of humanity's highest possibilities was preserved for anyone who needed proof that communities could organize themselves according to principles of love and cooperation. The visitor that morning was Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a young sociologist from Tokyo who had come to study the archive as part of his doctoral research on what academics had begun calling the global emergence of structured mutual aid networks. His dissertation was documenting how communities around the world had independently developed similar approaches to collective welfare while maintaining their cultural distinctiveness and local autonomy, suggesting that mutual aid represented fundamental human capacities that could express themselves through countless variations while maintaining certain essential characteristics. Professor Chun, Dr. Tanaka said, using the honorary title that Sarah had acquired through her decades of correspondence and consultation with communities and universities, I'm particularly interested in understanding how the documentation process itself influenced the development of mutual aid networks. Did the act of recording these practices somehow strengthen them or help them spread? Sarah smiled at the question that reflected sophisticated understanding of how documentation could become a form of intervention, how witnessing could transform both observer and observed, and how archives could become living resources rather than static repositories of historical information. That's the question I've been thinking about for 35 years, she replied as she guided Dr. Tanaka through sections of the archive that now contain materials from communities on every continent. I think the act of careful documentation helped people understand that their individual acts of kindness were part of larger patterns, that their community's innovations were connected to universal human capacities, and that their local experiments could inspire similar efforts in distant places. The archive had evolved far beyond its original function as storage for police reports. It now contained correspondence from thousands of communities, photographs and videos documenting various innovations, research studies analyzing different Approaches to mutual aid implementation. Policy reports examining how formal institutions could support informal networks, and educational materials that helped new communities understand how to adapt proven principles to their own circumstances. And challenges. Dr. Tanaka was particularly interested in what he called the transmission mechanisms, how principles and practices had spread from community to community without formal organization or institutional coordination. His research was documenting how information about successful mutual aid innovations had traveled through personal relationships, conference presentations, academic publications, internet communications, and various forms of cultural exchange that had created a global learning network without central control or standardized procedures. What strikes me most about the communities I've studied, Dr. Tanaka explained as they paused in the section containing materials from Asian communities, is how they seem to discover similar solutions independently, as if mutual aid principles represent natural responses to human social needs, rather than artificial constructs that require complex teaching or institutional support. Sarah recognized that the young researcher was identifying something profound, evidence that the mutual aid networks documented in the archive represented not unusual innovations, but normal expressions of human community that became visible when people understood what was possible and committed themselves to creating environments where caring for others was supported rather than discouraged by social and economic systems. The archive now contained documentation from more than 3,000 communities that had implemented various approaches to mutual aid and sustainable development, representing every continent and virtually every cultural and economic circumstance. The diversity of specific practices was remarkable, but certain patterns appeared consistently across different contexts: voluntary participation, dignity preservation, collective responsibility for individual welfare, integration of environmental stewardship with social development, and governance structures that balanced individual autonomy with collective decision-making. The most interesting finding from my research, Dr. Tanaka continued as they examined materials from communities that had developed innovative approaches to aging in place, is that mutual aid networks seem to strengthen rather than weaken over time when they're practiced consistently. Communities that have been implementing these principles for decades show increasing sophistication and effectiveness rather than the decline or stagnation that characterizes many social programs. Sarah understood that Dr. Tanaka was documenting something that had surprised many academics and policy experts: evidence that informal systems of community care could be more sustainable and adaptable than formal institutions when they were based on authentic relationships and shared values, rather than bureaucratic procedures and external funding sources. The archive materials revealed how communities had developed approaches to succession planning and knowledge transfer that ensured continuity across generations, while enabling adaptation to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. People who had grown up in mutual aid communities seemed to absorb these principles naturally while creating their own innovations that reflected both inherited wisdom and contemporary insights about community development and social organization. As the morning progressed and Dr. Tanaka continued his research, Sarah found herself reflecting on how her own understanding had evolved during the decades since she had first encountered those mysterious police reports in the basement filing cabinets. What had begun as investigation of unexplained phenomena had transformed into recognition that the phenomena were not unexplained at all, but represented normal expressions of human nature that became visible when people organized their communities according to principles that honored both individual dignity and collective welfare. The archive had become a demonstration that documentation could itself be a form of mutual aid, providing communities with evidence that alternatives to social isolation and environmental degradation were not just possible but practical and sustainable. When people understood what was required and committed themselves to the patient work of creating environments where everyone could flourish while contributing to common good. Dr. Tanaka's research was contributing to academic understanding of what some scholars were calling the mutual aid renaissance, the global emergence of communities that were implementing principles of cooperation and collective responsibility, while maintaining their effectiveness and appeal across diverse cultural contexts and challenging circumstances. The research was documenting how these communities had influenced policy development, educational innovation, environmental protection, and economic development while maintaining their essential character as voluntary associations of people who had chosen to care for each other. "What I find most hopeful," Dr. Tanaka said as he reviewed materials from communities that had successfully addressed challenges related to climate change adaptation, "is that these networks seem to generate rather than consume social capital. Communities that practice mutual aid consistently show increasing capacity for addressing new challenges and taking advantage of emerging opportunities rather than becoming depleted by the effort required to maintain cooperative relationships." Sarah recognized that the young researcher was identifying one of the most significant findings from decades of documentation: evidence that caring for others created rather than diminished individual and community resources, that cooperation generated rather than consumed energy, and that mutual aid networks could become increasingly sophisticated and effective over time when they were practiced according to principles that honored both human nature and ecological wisdom. The archive had become proof that love was indeed more powerful than fear, that cooperation was more sustainable than competition, and that communities could organize themselves according to their highest values while addressing practical challenges that required both technical innovation and social wisdom. As Dr. Tanaka prepared to conclude his research visit and return to Tokyo, where he would complete his dissertation and continue his work documenting global innovations in community development, Sarah found herself reflecting on how the archive had fulfilled purposes that she could never have anticipated when she had first begun exploring those dusty filing cabinets. The basement storage area that had once held mysterious police reports had become a center for global learning about community development and social innovation. The documentation that had begun as attempts to solve unexplained phenomena had evolved into evidence that the phenomena were not unexplained, but represented fundamental human capacities that could be developed and strengthened when people understood what was possible. The archive had become what it had always been documenting, a form of assistance that appeared wherever it was needed, providing communities with practical resources and emotional support for their efforts to create alternatives to social systems that failed to honor human dignity or environmental health. "Professor Chun," Dr. Tanaka said as he prepared to leave, "I want to thank you for preserving and sharing this documentation. My research suggests that archives like this one play crucial roles in helping communities understand that their local innovations are connected to larger movements, that their individual efforts contribute to collective transformation, and that alternatives to current social and economic systems are not just theoretical possibilities, but practical realities that have been tested and refined through decades of patient practice." Sarah understood that Dr. Tanaka was recognizing something that had taken her decades to fully appreciate, that the archive had become more than historical documentation, but had evolved into ongoing demonstration that human communities could organize themselves according to principles of mutual care and collective responsibility that created environments where everyone could live with dignity, security, and hope for the future. As evening approached, and Sarah prepared to close the archive for another day, she found herself thinking about all the communities around the world that were continuing to implement and refine innovations in mutual aid and sustainable development. The global mutual aid network now included more than 10,000 communities that were sharing resources and supporting each other's efforts to create comprehensive alternatives to social isolation and environmental degradation. The network had demonstrated that voluntary cooperation on a planetary scale was possible when Communities shared commitment to values that transcended cultural boundaries and geographical distances, while maintaining their local autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. The communities had created innovations that addressed virtually every aspect of human social organization: governance, economics, education, healthcare, environmental stewardship, cultural preservation, and spiritual development. The archive would continue to grow and evolve as new communities discovered mutual aid principles, while existing communities developed new applications and refinements that enhanced their effectiveness and sustainability. The documentation would preserve evidence that human societies could organize themselves according to their highest values while addressing contemporary challenges that required both traditional wisdom and innovative approaches to community development. As Sarah turned off the lights and prepared to leave the archive, she understood that her individual journey from investigating mysteries to facilitating global communication had been completed, but that the work of demonstrating alternatives to fear and competition would continue as long as communities needed evidence that love could become the organizing principle for human societies, committed to creating environments where everyone could flourish. The archive had solved the greatest mystery of all: the endless human capacity to create home wherever love was chosen over fear, cooperation over competition, and mutual care over individual struggle. The basement filing cabinets that had once held unexplained police reports now contained proof that such choices were not only possible but practical, not only idealistic but effective, not only hoped for but achieved by communities around the world that had committed themselves to demonstrating that people could learn to live together according to their highest values and most generous understanding of what it meant to be fully human. The fluorescent lights had been replaced by LED systems that provided the same steady illumination with greater efficiency and environmental sustainability, but the essential purpose remained unchanged: preserving evidence that communities could function according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility that created something approaching the ideal of what human society could become when it operated according to the simple understanding that individual welfare and collective health were not separate concerns, but different aspects of the same fundamental truth about the nature of authentic community. The mystery was solved, and the solution was beautiful. People caring for each other because that was what people did when they remembered that love was more powerful than fear, that cooperation was more sustainable than competition, and that communities could create environments where everyone could live with dignity, security, and hope when they understood that caring for others was not an obligation but a privilege, not a burden but a joy, not a mystery but the most natural expression of what it meant to live in authentic relationship with others who shared responsibility for ensuring that the future would be more loving, more just, and more sustainable than the past. Professor Sarah Chen sat in the observation room of the Millfield Community School, watching through one-way glass as 8-year-old Maya Gonzalez stood before a small group of visiting elderly residents from a neighboring town, explaining with the patient clarity of someone who had never known any other way of living how her community organized itself to ensure that everyone's needs were met. The delegation had come to learn about Millfield's approach to intergenerational care, but Maya's presentation was revealing something far more profound: evidence of how children who grew up in mutual aid communities developed fundamentally different assumptions about human nature and social organization. Every person has something they're good at and something they need help with, Maya explained, using a colorful chart that showed how different community members contributed various skills while receiving different types of assistance. Mrs. Patterson teaches us about books and stories, but she needs help carrying heavy things. Mr. Rodriguez fixes everyone's cars, but he needs help reading letters because his eyes don't work so well anymore. My grandmother makes the best soup in the whole valley, but she needs people to drive her to the doctor's office. The visiting elderly residents listened with expressions that shifted from polite attention to amazed recognition as Maya described a world where interdependence was not a source of shame, but a fundamental organizing principle that created security for everyone. Her matter-of-fact tone suggested that she had never encountered the idea that needing help was embarrassing or that providing assistance was burdensome rather than fulfilling. Sarah had been invited to observe these educational sessions as part of her ongoing research into how mutual aid principles were transmitted across generations. At 82, she had become the unofficial chronicler of what academics were calling the fourth generation effect, the emergence of young people whose grandparents had been among the original implementers of community care networks and whose parents had grown up taking mutual aid for granted as the normal way that communities functioned. Maya represented something unprecedented. In Sarah's decades of documentation, a child whose entire social environment had been organized around principles of cooperation and collective responsibility, who had never experienced or witnessed social isolation or competitive individualism as organizing principles for human relationships. Her presentation revealed assumptions about community life that would have seemed utopian to previous generations, but that she accepted as simple descriptions of how the world worked. When someone new moves to our community, Maya continued, responding to a question from one of the visitors about how newcomers were integrated into the mutual aid networks. We have a welcome circle where everyone shares something they know how to do and something they would like to learn. Then we make connections so that the new person can teach someone and learn from someone right away. That way they become part of helping and being helped from the very beginning. The integration process that Maya described had evolved from decades of experience with community development, but she presented it as naturally as she might describe how seeds grew into plants or how rain filled the streams that watered their gardens. Her generation had inherited sophisticated systems of community organization without experiencing them as complex innovations that required special effort to maintain. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, now in her 70s and serving as director of the Global Institute for Community Studies, had accompanied Sarah to observe these sessions as part of a comprehensive study of how mutual aid communities were preparing young people for leadership roles in an increasingly interconnected world. The research was documenting how children from mutual aid communities performed academically, developed socially, and approached problem-solving compared to peers from more conventional social environments. What strikes me most, Dr. Rodriguez whispered to Sarah as they watched Maya field questions with remarkable poise and sophistication, is how naturally these children assume that complex problems require collaborative solutions. They don't seem to consider individual competition or institutional control as viable approaches to addressing community challenges. The observation was significant because it suggested that mutual aid principles could become so deeply embedded in social consciousness that they shaped fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. Maya's generation was developing worldviews that prioritized cooperation over competition, collective welfare over individual advantage, and community resilience over institutional dependence in ways that seemed likely to influence how they approached challenges throughout their lives. As the presentation continued, Maya described how her community had organized itself to address environmental challenges through integrated approaches that combined traditional knowledge with contemporary innovation. Her explanation revealed sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and systems thinking that had been developed through hands-on participation in community projects rather than abstract classroom instruction. We have solar panels on all our houses and a window that makes electricity for the whole village, Maya explained, pointing to photographs that showed the renewable energy systems that had made Millfield energy independent. But we also plant trees and take care of the forest, because trees make oxygen and clean the water and give homes to the animals. Everything is connected. So we have to think about how our choices affect everything else. The ecological literacy that Maya demonstrated reflected educational approaches that integrated environmental science with community development, enabling children to understand their place in larger systems that required their care and attention. Her generation was developing practical knowledge about sustainability, while absorbing values that prioritized long-term thinking over short-term convenience. Sarah found herself thinking about how different Maya's presentation was from conventional approaches to civic education that typically focused on individual rights and institutional structures rather than community relationships and collective responsibilities. Maya's understanding of citizenship emphasized participation and mutual support rather than abstract concepts about democratic governance or individual freedom. Visiting elderly residents were clearly moved by Maya's presentation, but also somewhat overwhelmed by implications of what they were witnessing. Several had grown up during historical periods when mutual aid was more common in rural communities, but none had experienced comprehensive community organization that addressed virtually every aspect of social life through cooperative approaches. In your community, asked Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an 86-year-old visitor from the neighboring town, what happens when people disagree about important decisions? How do you resolve conflicts without someone being in charge to make final choices? Maya considered the question with the thoughtfulness of someone who had participated in community decision-making processes since she was old enough to express opinions. Her response revealed sophisticated understanding of consensus building and conflict resolution that most adults struggled to master. We have community circles where everyone can share their ideas and feelings, Maya explained. The grown-ups help us understand different perspectives and find solutions that work for everyone. Sometimes it takes a long time, but usually we can figure out ways to do things that make everyone feel heard and respected. When we can't agree, we try small experiments to see what works best before making big decisions. Asterisk, the conflict resolution processes that Maya described had been refined through decades of community practice, but she presented them as normal parts of social life rather than special techniques that required expert facilitation or professional training. Her generation was learning to navigate disagreement and difference through collaborative approaches that strengthened rather than damaged community relationships. As the morning session concluded and the visitors prepared to tour other aspects of Millfield's community infrastructure, Sarah found herself reflecting on how Maya's presentation had revealed the cumulative impact of generations of commitment to mutual aid principles. The child's worldview represented inheritance of wisdom that had been developed through decades of patient practice and continuous refinement. The afternoon brought another observation opportunity as Sarah watched 12-year-old David Chun facilitate a peer mediation session between two classmates who had been involved in a playground conflict. His approach demonstrated skills in active listening, perspective-taking, and collaborative problem-solving that many professional mediators worked years to develop. I want to understand what happened from both of your perspectives, David said to the two students who had requested his assistance in resolving their disagreement. Can each of you help me understand what you were feeling and what you were trying to accomplish? Then maybe we can figure out a way for both of you to get what you need without anyone feeling hurt or left out. The mediation process that David facilitated reflected training that all Millfield students received in conflict resolution and community problem solving. But more significantly, it demonstrated internalized values that prioritized relationship preservation over individual victory, collaborative solution finding over competitive Advantage. Sarah observed how David's approach differed from conventional approaches to childhood conflict that typically focused on rule enforcement or punishment rather than understanding and resolution. His generation was learning to address disagreement through methods that strengthened rather than damaged social relationships while addressing underlying needs and concerns. The mediation concluded with both students expressing satisfaction with the solution they had developed collaboratively, but also with renewed appreciation for each other's perspectives and circumstances. David's facilitation had created opportunities for empathy and understanding rather than simply resolving the immediate conflict. The most remarkable thing, Dr. Rodriguez noted as they observed the mediation, is how naturally these children assume that conflicts can be resolved through collaborative processes that serve everyone's interests. They don't seem to consider winning and losing as inevitable outcomes of disagreement. Asterisk. The observation reflected broader patterns that researchers were documenting in mutual aid communities around the world. Children who grew up in environments organized around cooperation and collective responsibility developed problem-solving approaches that differed significantly from peers who were raised in more competitive or individualistic social environments. As the day continued, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez observed various aspects of community life that revealed how young people were being prepared for leadership roles in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The educational approaches integrated academic learning with practical community participation, cultural preservation with innovation, local knowledge with global awareness at the Millfield community. School had become a model for place-based education that prepared students for higher education and professional careers while maintaining their connections to community values and environmental stewardship. Graduates pursued various paths, but many returned to contribute their knowledge and skills to community development while maintaining networks with classmates who had settled in other places. What we're seeing, Dr. Rodriguez explained as they watched teenagers working on community service projects that addressed both learning objectives and practical community needs, is evidence that young people can be prepared for success in competitive global economies while maintaining their commitment to cooperative values and community welfare. The research was documenting how mutual aid communities were preparing young people to function effectively in conventional social and economic systems while preserving their capacity to create alternative approaches that prioritized collective welfare and environmental sustainability over individual accumulation and competitive advantage. As evening approached and Sarah prepared to return to her temporary lodging in the village center, she found herself reflecting on how the day's observations had revealed something unprecedented. Evidence that human communities could successfully transmit values of cooperation and mutual care across multiple generations while adapting to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. Maya and David represented the fourth generation of young people who had grown up in communities organized around mutual aid principles. Their worldviews, problem-solving approaches, and assumptions about human nature suggested that cooperative values could become so deeply embedded in social consciousness that they shaped fundamental approaches to addressing individual and collective challenges. The evening brought a community gathering where young people shared presentations about projects they had been working on that addressed various aspects of community development and environmental stewardship. The presentations revealed sophisticated understanding of complex systems and collaborative approaches that suggested promising futures for communities that had invested decades in developing alternative approaches to social organization. As Sarah listened to teenagers describe innovations in sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, community governance, and cultural preservation, she understood that she was witnessing the emergence of a generation that had inherited the wisdom of their elders while developing new applications and refinements that enhanced community capacity for addressing contemporary challenges. That the young people spoke in a language that had no words for loneliness, that assumed cooperation rather than competition as the natural response to shared challenges, that prioritized collective welfare rather than individual advantage as the measure of success. Their voices carried the future into the present, demonstrating that human communities could organize themselves according to their highest values while preparing young people to create even more loving, just, and sustainable approaches to social life. In the children's confident explanations of how communities worked, Sarah heard evidence that the archive's documentation of human kindness had evolved into something unprecedented. Comprehensive social environments where mutual aid was not exceptional behavior, but normal expression of how people naturally cared for each other when they grew up. Understanding that individual welfare and collective health were not separate concerns, but different aspects of the same fundamental truth about what it meant to live in authentic community with others.